Section 1 of Circe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nova Silva. Circe by Babington White, Volume 1. Scene the first. A painting room in Charnock Street. Heureux celui dont le cœur ne demande qu'un cœur, et qui ne désire ni parc à l'anglaise, ni opéra syrien, ni musique de Mozart, ni tableau de Raphaël, ni éclipse de lune, ni même un clair de lune, ni scène de roman, ni leur accomplissement. There is a neighborhood which the Brotherhood of Painters has marked as its own. Radiating from Fitzroy Square, the London pedestrian finds a labyrinth of dingy streets, where ever and anon he sees the elongated window peculiar to the painter's den. These dull, murky streets, which have a certain air of having seen better days, are the haunt of struggling art. Successful art takes itself wings and flies away to Kensington, where the painter's soul expands in a fairer region beneath brighter skies and amid the twittering of birds and the rustling of forest trees. Here and there some great man lingers in the dingy neighborhood, as if loath to leave the strugglers alone and disheartened. But the neighborhood grows dingier every day, and every day the successful painters are flying westward. To Laurence Bell, gold medalist and student, hard at work in his painting room all day long, the dullness of the neighborhood was a matter of small importance. A man does not live only in the square brick box he hires from his landlord. He has a habitation of his own, situated in a world of his own creating, for which he pays neither rent nor taxes. You shall find two men occupying the same house, and yet living as far apart as if they were inhabitants of Kamchatka and Peru. One may be the dweller in a fair and flowery region, where the voices of singing birds make music for him all day long. The other, the denizen of an Arctic wilderness, peopled by prowling bears. You shall see two men pacing the same stone pavement, and while one treads lightly on the blossom-starred turf of a paradise, the other tramps toilfully through the hot ashes of a pandemonium. 'Tis in ourselves that we are thus or thus. The world occupied by Laurence Bell was a very pleasant one. He was a painter, and the surroundings of Charnock Street, Fitzroy Square, were not so real to him as the white-walled palaces of Italy and the airy facades of Athens, which he had only seen in his dreams. He was young, and to his mind a glorious future seemed a bright certainty, so fair and dazzling that it is scarcely strange if he was somewhat blind to the dinginess of the present. The glamour of his art was upon him, and the world was a radiant panorama inhabited by the gods and goddesses of the Italian painters. Nor was there wanting in his life that other species of enchantment common to commoner men. As Laurence Bell sat before his easel in the chilly March twilight, a girlish figure stood beside his chair. As fair a face as any he had ever painted, looked tenderly down into the painter's dark blue eyes. There are some men into whose cradles the Graces seem to have showered their richest gifts. There are some storybook princes and princesses of this world to whose christening festivals no malicious fairy has found admittance. Laurence Bell was one of these. Grace, genius, and beauty are no small gifts, and on Laurence all three had been bestowed with a lavish hand. The only fault in the fair young face was that it was a little too faultless. The Antinous is a beautiful image, but they who seek a noble type of manhood will find it rather in the Hercules. His fellow students of the Faubourg de Fitzroy told Laurence Bell that he was like Raphael, and it is possible that he cultivated the likeness. The long, loose, golden hair, which fell on his Byronic collar, might have been an unpardonable affectation in an older man. But to an offender of 22, much is forgiven. And who was the young student? From what grand old race of medieval warriors did he inherit those profoundly blue eyes? From what patrician ancestry did he derive those slender white hands, with the tapering fingers and rose-tinted, filbert-shaped nails? To what Arab chieftain's blood did he owe the arched instep, beneath which water might flow? Alas for romance and poetry. This young Antinous was the son of a German tailor and his pretty English wife, an honest, humble couple who had fought the hard battle of life bravely enough in their own quiet way, only to be beaten. They were both at rest now, after the hard, bitter struggle. They slumbered side by side in the little suburban cemetery, where Laurence went sometimes in the summer gloaming to decorate the lowly grave with flowers. Laurence must, in all probability, have followed his father's joyless trade, designing nothing grander than the pattern of a waistcoat, if Signor Antonio Mocatti, better known to his friends and to the public as Mr. Mocatti, had not happened to walk past the tailor's shop one summer's afternoon when the boy was seated on the doorstep, drawing. Nothing in the shape of draughtsmanship ever escaped the glance of Mr. Mocatti. He was a big, broad-shouldered Neapolitan, with the blackest and sharpest eyes possible to humanity, and a very thick black mustache, which was the pride and delight of his soul. For the rest, he was a man whom people called handsome, a florid, hook-nosed personage with a harmless weakness for resplendent satin socks, black velvet waistcoats, and braided overcoats lined with fur. There were people who said that Antonio Mocatti had followed more than one calling in the vast city of his adoption, and who even went so far as to affirm that the nest egg of the signor's fortune had been earned by him as a dealer in penny ices, in the days when penny ices were not as yet an agreeable novelty to the mind of the Londoner. The signor himself declared that he was the son of a noble house, exiled on account of his too liberal opinions. And as he had some amount of education, the penny ice legend was maintained only by his enemies. Whatever his antecedents, Mr. Mocatti, of Pelham Lodge, Old Brompton, was now a distinguished picture dealer, the patron of rising talent, and the plenipotentiary from the court of art to the kingdom of commerce. When a wealthy Manchester magnate wanted pictures, he gave Mr. Mocatti carte blanche, and lo, his dining room and entrance hall became resplendent with gems of the purest art. Even those who abused Antonio Mocatti for a cheat and a charlatan were fain to admit that the man's taste was faultless, and that a bad picture never came out of his hands. "He smells them out, sir," cried an angry artist. "It's that big nose of his does all the business. If there's a pretty little bit in the darkest corner of a room full of duffers, Moccatti's down upon it before he's been in the room 3 minutes, and he couldn't do that if it wasn't for his nose, sir." Mr. Mocatti swooped down on the little fair-haired boy, and seized the slate in his big primrose-gloved paw. "By Jove!" he cried. "It's the Apollo! Where did the brat get the Apollo?" He pointed to the figure on the slate, transfixed in astonishment. There was the Apollo in little, scratched by a tailor's boy's ignorant hand on a tailor's slate, amidst memoranda about coats and trousers. "Please, sir, there's a stationer's shop round the corner, and the picture of the man is in the window. I've looked at it very hard, sir, and I was trying to do it." "Oh, you're trying to copy a picture round the corner, are you?" said the dealer. "What would you say if I set you to copy pictures that would not be round the corner, and, after that, real-life men and women, who would stand on a platform till their bodies ached for your convenience? How would you like that, little tailor boy?" "I would like it very much indeed, if you please, sir," answered the boy, abashed by the splendid stranger. Whereupon Mr. Mocatti went into the tailor's humble shop and bought the tailor's son, so far as the laws of England will allow the purchase of a boy. Laurence Bell was to be the goods and chattels of Antonio Mocatti for the next 10 years of his life, during which time he was to be fed and taught and clothed by that speculator. For the 5 following years, half the painter's earnings were to be the property of the picture dealer, and it was during these last 5 years that Mr. Mocatti was to reap the fruits of his investment. The bargain seemed fair enough. What could Peter Bell and his wife do with the genius that had been born to them? "It is a hard thing to part from him," said the tailor, "but it would be a harder thing that the child should be running errands for me when the Italian gentleman can put him in the road to become a great painter." And the poor man wiped his eyes piteously as he contemplated his son, eager as are ever such young fledglings to fly away from the parental nest. So, after a few days' consideration, and more than one wakeful night, the father dressed the lad in his smartest raiment, and handed him over to the picture dealer. But not before he had duly signed a document prepared by that gentleman's solicitor. Mr. Mocatti took his young protégé straight to the house of another protégé, a middle-aged painter who had never achieved any market success, and who now worked solely for the Neapolitan dealer. "Look here, Greystone," said the speculator. "This boy has the makings of a great painter. I want you to lick him into shape. He can attend the Life Academy when he's old enough and so on, and he can live with you. I'll allow you 100 a year for his board and instruction, and you must contrive to make something good out of him, Tom Greystone." Mr. Greystone was poor, and perhaps it was his poverty rather than his will which consented to oblige Mr. Mocatti. There was no kindly matron in the painter's household, and Laurence Bell's new life would have been strange and lonely if it had not been for the companionship of his master's only child, a little girl, 3 years younger than Laurence, very fair and delicate and pretty, a fond, caressing little creature, whose presence brightened the dull, dusty rooms, and whose young voice made music all day long. Mr. Mocatti was a man who never made mistakes. His investment in a boy turned out as lucky as most of his other investments. At 19 years of age, Thomas Greystone's pupil was the wonder of the Life Academy. At 22, he had distinguished himself as an exhibitor, and his pictures already commanded decent prices. "They sell pretty well as I work them, sir," said Mr. Mocatti, whereby he would have implied that it was his working rather than the merit of the pictures which procured the prices in question. Thomas Greystone had been a conscientious master. He now acknowledged that his pupil had passed beyond his teachings. "Let the boy go to the Vatican, and take a lesson from Raphael," said he. "I can do nothing more for him." Antonio Mocatti was not so easily pleased. "What is that which you sing me there?" he cried contemptuously in his Neapolitan French. "This child knows no more how to paint than a monkey. I will find you a monkey in your garden of plants here, which will do as much as he if you keep him in your painting room a month or two. My monkey will draw you Dutch dolls, and will mix you flake white and vermilion and gamboge upon his palette, and call it flesh color, and will paint his Dutch dolls dark on one side and light on the other, and call it chiaroscuro. It is not such great things for my monkey. Bah, Tom Greystone! The day will come when Laurence Bell will be a painter, but today he paints like that!" And the connoisseur emphasized his speech with a little gesture that savored of the mobile. "You don't tell your Manchester men that," said Mr. Greystone with a malicious grin. "I tell my Manchester men that I have a protégé who paints tableaux de genre better than any man in London," answered Mocatti. "But I don't offer to sell my Manchester men that cream-colored Venus yonder. Laurence paints his Venuses pour le distraire. But we must have pretty little women, in yellow satin, with Spanish mantillas on their heads, and big black eyes, which look at you like 1,000 devils, to boil the pot, as you say in your English slang." Laurence Bell painted pot-boilers, as his patron directed him. Charming little pictures these pot-boilers were. Now a scene from such perennial sources as the Vicar of Wakefield or Don Quixote. Now a hazardous little bit from Alfred de Musset. Anon a glimpse of a graceful home life, rich with the sheen of satin and the luminous glow of a fire, or the mellow light of a shaded lamp. Now, a girl on a balcony looking up at the stars. Now, a shrouded cavalier waiting at a Venetian street corner with murderous eyes flashing athwart the dusk. Mr. Mocatti was very well satisfied with his bargain, though it was his habit to be contemptuous and doubtful of his protégé's merits in a good-humored way. There was a certain amount of sincerity, even in this affectation of scorn. The man's belief in the young painter was so great that to him these pretty cabinet pictures, these crude, undeveloped nymphs and goddesses, seemed only the blind gropings of a mighty genius which was trying to push its way into the light. "There is the stuff in you to make a great painter than your pragmatical England has seen for 100 years, cried the dealer. "But you are only playing with art. You are a child. You want depth and passion, force and fire. You want a little madness, my friend, to make you a genius. There are no sane geniuses." While Laurence Bell grappled with the rudiments of his art, Amy Greystone received the orthodox young lady's education at a Brixton boarding school. When Laurence attained his majority, and the agreement between his dead parents and Antonio Mocatti became so much waste paper — Mr. Mocatti took care not to inform his protégé of this fact, by the way — Miss Greystone came home from school, being 18 years of age, and finished. She brought a great many gaudily bound prize volumes with her, the covers of which offended her father's eye for color, and she was posted in the dates of every important event in the world's history, from the destruction of Sennacherib and his army to the passing of the Reform Bill, The gaudy bindings of the prize volumes faded and grew dingy in the dust and sunshine of Charnock Street, and the dates melted one by one out of Miss Greystone's memory. When these were gone, there remained very little result from the Brixton education. But Amy Greystone was just one of those charming and lovable creatures who have no occasion to be clever. She sang Moore's melodies in a voice which went straight to the hearts of her listeners, and she could play tender little scraps of Italian music and wailing German waltzes, which were very sweet to hear in the twilight. She was very pretty, but her beauty was of so unobtrusive a character that you might be in a room with her for an hour before you discovered how great a claim she had on your admiration. She was, in short, one of those women who may pass through a London season of balls and parties, and flower shows and races, unrewarded by a single conquest, but who cannot inhabit the same house with a man for a week without making him her slave. Laurence Bell had lived under the same roof with the painter's daughter for a year, and long before the year was over, he loved her and had declared his love. He was the sort of man whose heritage it is to be idolized by women, and to suffer at their hands. He was the stuff which makes a Chastelard or a Königsmarck. To Amy, he seemed the ideal of all that is brightest and most poetical in mankind. To be loved by him was to be the elect of the gods. Thomas Greystone, the painter, consented to his daughter's engagement, but he was by no means rapturous in his observations on the subject. "I had rather you had fallen in love with a tallow chandler," he said. "I dare say you think it's a fine thing to marry a genius, poor child. You don't know as much of that kind of creature as I do. The wife of a genius is a social martyr, who fits herself to wear the palm while her husband earns his laurels. I suppose you never read poor Haydon's diary. Read a few pages of that interesting work, my love, and compassionate Mrs. Haydon." Miss Greystone raised herself upon tiptoe and kissed her papa, but she set very small value upon his worldly wisdom. She thought so much of her lover that she had very little leisure for the consideration of her own interests. If there was palm to be worn by one of them, she was ready to accept the crown of martyrdom, provided there were plenty of laurels for her idol. She hated the gorgeous Neapolitan picture dealer, with his braided overcoats and velvet waistcoats and resplendent patent leather boots that were always so disagreeably new, and the odor of musk and ambergris which came with his presence, and his disdainful shrugs and contemptuous gnawing of mustache and pulling of whisker, and his tradesman-like talk of subjects that would sell or would not sell, and effects that were or were not adapted for the work of the engraver. This evening, while Laurence rests himself in the gloaming after a laborious day, he and Amy are talking of the great Mocatti. "But you will not be obliged to slave for him always, dear," whispered the girl in response to some complaint of her lover's. "I look forward to the day when you will be your own master, and then you will be able to paint what you please." "Yes, I shall be able to paint my Oedipus at Colonna," answered the young man in an excited tone. "Such a grand subject, Amy. Grander than Lear. The old man, blind, dying, with uplifted hands and awful sightless eyes, invoking the divinities of hell and calling down destruction upon his unworthy sons. The two devoted daughters, the classic background, Oh, Amy, if I could only follow the bent of my own fancy, if I could find time to paint that picture." "What a noble waste of time and canvas and color and bristles of innocent pigs there would be," cried a sonorous voice in the doorway of the chamber. And then the door, which had been standing ajar, was pushed open, and enter Mr. Mocatti, with the usual odor of musk and the usual splendor of velvet and braiding. "Mon enfant, there is no longer room in civilized Europe for your blind old conundrum-guessing king, unless it is against a newly plastered outer wall in some provincial mechanics institute, where there is once a month a lecture on electricity or the sidereal heavens, or a reading of Locksley Hall and the Bridge of Shirts by a pet parson, and where your Oedipus will become as blue and moldy as a Stilton cheese. How do you do, Miss Amy? As pretty as ever, and as much in love with our young Raphael as ever, I suppose. We give you leave to fall in love with him, Miss Amy, but not to marry him. He is not to marry for 10 years to come. He is not to marry until he has done great things." "Hands off there, if you please, Mr. Mocatti," cried Laurence. "You have bought a claim on my industry, but not my freedom as a man. Miss Greystone will become my wife whenever I can obtain her consent to accept that position. I shall neither consult you before fixing my wedding day, nor ask you to support my wife. And I shall certainly not tolerate the faintest approach to insolence in your conduct towards Miss Greystone." Amy was not in the room when her lover so bravely defended his right of action. She had withdrawn quietly into the adjoining chamber, but as the door of communication between the two rooms was not quite closed, it is just possible the young lady was gratified by hearing Mr. Bell's spirited assertion of independence. She heard no more, for the Machiavellian Mocatti espied this unshut door, and closed it deliberately before continuing the conversation. "And so you are going to marry, mon cher," he said. "Yes. I am proud to say Miss Greystone has consented—" "Never mind Miss Greystone," cried the Neapolitan with a contemptuous snap of his fingers. "There are 100,000 Miss Greystones in the world, ready to be the eternal perdition of rising genius. Look at that window there, my friend, 2 stories high, and overlooking a nice little area and a row of strong iron spikes, which might serve to finish a man if the fall were not sufficient. Will you be so kind as to throw yourself out, mon enfant?" Mr. Bell contemplated his patron in silent wonder. "Oblige me by throwing yourself out of the window," said Mocatti in his most insinuating tone. "I don't suppose it hurts one, much, to fall upon the spikes, because you see one is happily stunned by the concussion of air before one arrives at the spikes. At the worst, it is much better for you than marriage." "Pshaw, you talk like an idiot," muttered Laurence impatiently. "I talk like a man who has had his dealings with genius and knows what stuff it is made of. Do you want to be a trader in colored canvas, or a great painter? I want you to be a great painter. I have plenty of protégés who bring me money. I want you to do something more than that. The diamonds that every jeweler deals in are very well in their way. But the jeweler has his profit, and there an end. I want to be pointed out as the owner of a blue diamond, and it is in you to be that blue diamond, if you please, Laurence Bell." This appeal went straight home to the weakest spot in the painter's character. It flattered his vanity. He felt a thrill of rapture as he thought that it might indeed be in his power to become the blue diamond among painters. "I know how much you have done for me, Mocatti," he said, considerably softened in tone and manner. "And I hope I have done my duty. You never had reason to complain of my want of industry." "Bah!" cried the picture dealer. "Industry is a journeyman tailor's virtue. I want something more than that." "You cannot ask more from me than I am willing to give, nay, eager to give. I am ready to devote every faculty I possess to art. What else do I live for? But the artist has a right to a home. Why, then, do you oppose my marriage?" "Because for you marriage would be ruin." "But why?" But why, echoed the dealer impatiently. "Why does laudanum make you sleepy? Why does water extinguish fire? I tell you, a genius married and settled is a genius flat-ironed into a commonplace, rate-paying, cradle-rocking, church-going, 2 o'clock dinner-eating nonentity. Poor wretch! His dreams were once peopled with gods and goddesses. Now his slumbers are haunted by butcher's bills. He used to wander away into lonely places and waste long hours face to face with nature. But now he must wheel a perambulator and contemplate nature in Bloomsbury Square. His habits used to be wild, nomadic, sometimes tramping over Welsh mountains, sometimes lingering in the fairest valleys of southern France, anon lost amid the grandeurs of alpine peak and glacier. But now his wildest rovings are comprised in an autumn trip to Margate or Broadstairs. Do you think art can survive the rocking of cradles and the vexation of butcher's bills? I tell you it cannot. If you are a genius, your proper element is fire. So much the worse for you if you don't like to be scorched. You are consumed by fever. So much the better. You pass from transports of hope to agonies of despair. You are lifted to the skies today. You grovel in the dust tomorrow. So much the better, and again, so much the better. Do you know why art is at a low level nowadays? It is because artists are too well recompensed. They live in comfortable houses, they pay their debts, they have dinner every day, and we have no more of those inspired works which were achieved in that golden age of art when painters died of starvation. Do you want to marry a pretty boarding school miss who will think it a fine thing to make you happy and comfortable after the fashion of a lawyer's clerk or a country curate? Nom du nom, cried the excited Mocatti. I will not live to behold such a sacrifice. Sooner I would stab myself and intercept my bleeding corpse between the altar and the victim. No, 1,000 times no, my Laurence, my pride, my glory. Break this girl's heart, break your own if you like, but don't talk of marriage. I would rather trample all my hopes in the dust than I would give Amy Greystone 1 hour's sorrow, answered Laurence gravely. Let me be happy in my own way, Mr. Mocatti. Happy in your own way? Do you think, foolish child, that any creature can be happy who is false to his destiny? Do you think you can shut up genius in a little box and screw it down with a lid like the mannequin in a child's toy? Do you think you can imprison the soul of a giant in the body of a dwarf? Bah! Do not let us put ourselves into passions, said Mr. Mocatti, who had worked himself into fever heat, and was fain to mop his floridly handsome face with a still more florid silk handkerchief. We will say no more of marriage. You shall paint pictures, and again more pictures. And 10 years hence, when you have made Europe ring with your name, and have earned the fortune of a Rothschild, if you like to marry the 11,000 virgins of Cologne, with their hair all combed off their faces and tied up into horses' tails after Hemling, I will not forbid the banns. Laurence Bell did not reply to this exordium. He had not attempted to stem the torrent of Mr. Moccatti's talk. But when Mr. Mocatti had said all he had to say, his protégé reserved the right to please himself. And now, let me see what you have done while I have been at Brighton, said the dealer. I am very well in with this year's hanging committee, and I want to see something of yours on the line. Il faut marcher, jeune homme. What is that under the green baize? Light the gas and let me see what I can. I was detained at a sale at Christie's, or I should have been with you before the light was all gone. Laurence lighted the gas and placed first one, then another canvas on his easel. They were pretty little cabinet pictures, of the kind one sees so often, and in which one almost always finds something to admire. One was a coquettish little soubrette of the Louis XV period, feeding some doves at an open window. The other a pair of lovers seated in a boat, drifting on a sunny river, with a forgotten guitar at their feet. Music on the water, muttered Mr. Mocatti, looking at the label which the painter had pasted on the back of his picture. Yes, that's pretty, very pretty. The sunshine on the girl's face is very nicely managed. Your rushes are rather stiff. Look as if you'd done them with a grainer's comb. And there's a little too much of the palette knife in your sky. Still, as far as it goes, it's a nice bit. They'll hang it in a corner, and it'll sell for £35. The Girl and the Birds may fetch 20. One may almost calculate those things to a sixpence. But when are you going to leave off painting pretty pictures? When are you going mad? When do you mean to give me my blue diamond? Laurence blushed and hesitated as he tried to answer this impetuous demand. The volcanic Italian fathomed the meaning of that blush. Mais mon Dieu, he cried. You have something more to show me. The blue diamond is coming. I am afraid it is scarcely worth showing you, faltered the young man, taking hold of a Kit-Kat-sized canvas that was turned with its face to the wall. The subject is hackneyed enough, you see, and I dare say the treatment is quite as commonplace as the subject. But I dreamt of the face one night after I'd been reading a translation of Aeschylus. Stop, cried Mr. Mocatti. The subject isn't from Aeschylus, I hope. No, it's from Shakespeare. The connoisseur gave a disdainful sniff. He said. Shakespeare is no great things, but he is better than Aeschylus. Laurence Bell placed his canvas on the easel and stood beside it, watching Mr. Moccatti's face more anxiously than it was his habit to do so when that gentleman pronounced judgment on his work. There was a rather long pause, during which Mr. Mocatti scrutinized the picture with his hands arched over his eyebrows. It was the picture of a woman, dark, imperious, grand, with a face that flashed out of the clear obscure, with a lurid brightness. She might have been Judith, or Clytemnestra, Semiramis, or Joanna of Naples. But for the satisfaction of an English public, Laurence had christened her Lady Macbeth. He had put daggers in her gleaming white nervous hands. He had draped her in heavy robes of purple and orange woolen stuff, and had placed a rude diadem on her queenly head. In her face he had strangely mingled vengeful passion and heroic resolve. So might look an angry goddess. So might look a murderous woman. Shrinking from her, and with his face half hidden, there was a cowering wretch whom one knew for the Thane of Cawdor. The scene was a grim stone hall, with one wide-open window through which you saw a dark gray sky, black wind-driven clouds, and one red, solitary star, which might have been the planet that rules the house of an assassin. Vous y êtes, mon cher, said Mocatti after his leisurely contemplation of the canvas. You've done the trick. If that picture is not hung on the line, if it is not written about and talked about and better abused than anything in the Academy, say that Antonio Mocatti is an imbecile. Embrace me, my treasure, cried the dealer. I can hope anything from you now.
You are beginning to go mad!
End of Section 1. Read by Nova Silva. Section 2 of Circe by Babington White, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Nova Silva. In the Royal Academy. Another isle is there, toward the north in the sea ocean, where that been full cruel and full evil women of nature. And they han precious stones in here eyen, and they been of that kind, that's if they beholden only man. They slen him anon with the beholding, as doth the basilisk. There were many equipage in Trafalgar Square, and there was a mighty gathering of footmen on the steps and in the portico of the Royal Academy. For that spring noontide had come which is of all noontides the chiefest and grandest in the world of art. It was the day set apart for the private view of the treasures to be exhibited that season in Trafalgar Square. Stately dowagers and elegant young women swept the crimson dugget with their rustling silken draperies. The academicians fidgeted to and fro nervously, receiving the congratulations of their friends. The art critics chewed the ends of their pencils, and made occasional notes in their catalogues, as marking down the quarry upon which they meant anon to swoop. The few privileged outsiders looked furtively at the painters, while pretending to be absorbed in the pictures. When the room was at its fullest, not filled with a jostling crowd as on common days, but agreeably furnished with animated faces and the sheen and flutter of feminine apparel, when the clock of St. Martin's in the Fields was striking 3, there entered Mr. Mocatti, the great picture dealer, upon whose coming there arose just the faintest possible commotion among the crowd, for the Neapolitan was known to the initiated, and was a person to be pointed out to the uninitiated as one of London's celebrities. Mr. Mocatti looked his handsomest, after his own florid manner, and had arrayed himself with more than usual splendor. He was on speaking terms with all the best people in the room, and while he was doing homage to aristocratic patrons and patronesses on every side, people had time to look at a young man who had entered the room with him, under the great man's wing, as it were, and with a somewhat deprecating manner, as if conscious of being too small a creature to come amongst that privileged assembly. "Who is that young man with the long yellow hair?" asked a lady. "Of course he is a painter. No one but a painter would presume to exhibit such hair."
"He exhibits something better than his hair," answered a royal academician, who was great enough to be generous. "Have you seen the Lady Macbeth?"
"What? That small full-length figure? Give me the daggers? Why, it is the best picture of the year, except—"
And here the lady faltered and broke down. "Except mine," said the academician, laughing. "Of course that is understood. No, it is not the best picture of the year, Lady Burton, but it is the most singular and the most promising. That young man will do great things if he takes care of himself."
While people were talking of his picture, the young man with the flowing locks kept as close as he could to the elbow of his protector. And that gentleman, having made obeisance to his customers and done a stroke or two of business, was now at liberty to patronize his protégé. "I told you you'd done the trick," he said confidentially. "The Lady Macbeth will be the sensation of the season, and you are a made man provided you steer clear of matrimony and butcher's bills. A little more madness, and a little more force and fever and fire and flame," said Mr. Mocatti, fondly prolonging the alliterative substantives, "and you will have mounted the ladder of fame, and that is the ladder which men ascend with a rush or not at all nowadays, mon ami. There was no such thing as creeping upwards by easy stages. Prometheus didn't steal his fire by installments." "Prometheus was a failure," murmured the young man rather sadly. "Has anyone bought the picture?" "I might have sold it a dozen times in the last half hour," replied the dealer. "But I am keeping it." "Keeping it? For whom?" "For a lady, one of my best customers. She is almost sure to be here today, and she is quite sure to want your picture." "Why?" "Because it is wild and strange. She has a mania for everything wild and strange. Elle en raffole. Yes, she will come," murmured Antonio Mocatti meditatively. "And you will see her, and then perhaps you will cease to talk of me of cette jeunesse, Miss Greystone." "There is no woman on earth whose influence can lessen my regard for Miss Greystone.
answered the young man earnestly. Attendez un peu, ma chère. You have not yet seen all the women on earth. And now, let us take a turn in the rooms. I will show you the lions. The young man gazed reverently on the faces which he had seen before only in a photographic album or a print seller's window. There was Mr. Van Eyck Willis, tall and handsome, with a certain haughty indifference of manner, talking to a sunny-faced matron, plump and comely as one of her husband's, King Charles's, beauties, fair sister among the brotherhood of the brush. And yonder came graceful Miss Edgars, as bright a vision as any of the slim young heroines in her facile pencil scatters broadcast for the enthrallment of pensive youth. There was Mr. Skiff, R.A., with his handsome wife and daughters, and Laurence Bell was struck with amazement that so popular a painter should be so genial and pleasant a man. And in the same group behold Mr. Belmore, also genial and pleasant, and making little jokes about everything and everybody. Afar stalked Mr. Bagmorilio, a trifle stern to strangers, but with a kindly and thoughtful smile for those he liked. And to Mr. Belmore comes Mr. Brooklet, the great landscape painter and amateur of old silver, exclaiming joyfully, "Another pair of Queen Anne candlesticks, Belmore! Come to the grove and expire with envy." "Look at that bearded gentleman in spectacles with a grave, handsome, dark-haired lady," says Mr. Mocatti, "and look at him respectfully, young man, for his is the voice that speaks in the columns of the morning Zeus. There is Mr. Catullus Fitzhorace, with his hair very wild and his hands in his pockets, and the sweetest, kindest smile on his frank, good-looking countenance. He writes delicious little verses, sparkling as Epernay, and classic as Falernian, and splashing articles in the conservative Sphora. That dashing gentleman in the doorway is Captain de Boots, the long-sword saddle-bridle novelist. And there, in a blue bonnet, is clever Miss Compsa, who imitates and caricatures his novels and has Ovid and Catullus, Virgil and Homer at the ends of her fingers. There is Miss Catherine Clive, the favorite young actress, une toute jeune fille, n'est-ce pas? As tall and slim and white as a lily. But we are soon to lose her. She goes to marry herself. She will have incalculable thousands, and ride about in a coach and six if she pleases, like the Duchess of St. Albans. But we shall see her no more. Ah, there is lovely Miss Fitzherbert, with her golden crinkly hair and her beautiful smile. Is it not that she is gracious? And now let us go and look at the engravings. I doubt myself much my lady will not come today." She was not coming, this nameless lady who was to buy his picture. The young painter felt one little pang of disappointment. It had of late seemed to him that there was only one woman in the world, and that her name was Amy Greystone. But, in spite of this, his interest, or at any rate his curiosity, had been aroused by Mr. Moccatti's brief description of his patroness. "What is the name of this wonderful woman?" he asked presently. "Her name is Julia d'Aspromonte, otherwise the Princess d'Aspromonte." "A princess," murmured the young man with a gasp. Even with the divinity of art upon him, he was still the son of a German tailor, and for the moment the high-sounding title took away his breath. "The widow of a Roman prince," said Mr. Mocatti with a shrug. "Ça ne vaut pas grand-chose. Luckily for her, the prince was a Jewish banker and had amassed the largest fortune ever accumulated within the papal dominions. But the princess has a genius for squandering money, and this generation may see the end of old Aspromonte's millions." "Palais des Anges," muttered the dealer, dropping his catalogue nervously. And, lo, Laurence Bell lifted his eyes towards the doorway of the little octagon chamber, and beheld the lady who was to buy his picture. He recognized her immediately. Why, he knew that this stranger was the woman Mocatti had been talking of. Why the beating of his heart quickened and the blood surged upward to his brain as he looked at her, formed a portion of the great enigma for which he never found any solution. For the moment, he was only conscious of his youth, his inexperience, his blushes, his awkwardness. How gladly he would have sunk through a convenient trap door in the flooring of the octagon chamber, to hide himself from the penetrating glances of that radiant being. Was she really so radiant? Was she indeed so very lovely? She was Italian, and had eyes and hair of that midnight blackness peculiar to the daughters of the South. Her face was cast in the true classic mold, too pale perhaps for beauty, a little worn and aged, as if the woman had lived and suffered much within the span of her 36 years. A face which one might fancy sublime when illumined by the lightning of passion, terrible if overshadowed by the gloom of despair, a face full of suggestiveness for poet or painter. Laurence Bell contemplated it wonderingly. It was so old and yet so new to him. He had seen it so often in his dreams, but never in earthly semblance till this day. "Go and distract yourself among the pictures," muttered Mr. Mocatti. "I'll introduce you presently." Laurence bowed and retired. He had to pass the Roman princess, and as he passed, his artistic eye caught every detail of her careless toilette. Ah, what an ineffable charm there was in that carelessness! The princess looked as if she had dressed herself en passant. The morning dress of soft India muslin and lace was a costume to be worn in a boudoir, and over that loose cloud-like robe there hung, for sole outer garment, the unstudied folds of a scarlet cashmere, worn as only a continental beauty can wear her shawl. For headgear, the princess had a tiny handkerchief of old point lace, and one natural yellow rose, le souvenir de Malmaison, nestling between the soft fabric and her purple-black hair. To the painter's fancy, it seemed as if the flower bent its perfumed petals to kiss the Roman lady's brow. In her hand she carried a bouquet of the same yellow roses, and their perfume filled the little room with an almost overpowering sweetness. "I should like to paint such a head, crowned with a garland of those pale roses," he thought to himself as he made his way through the larger rooms. In the middle room he found Mr. Greystone and his daughter. Thomas Greystone was well in with some of the great 40, and had procured tickets for this privileged view. Amy's soft blue eyes were on the watch for her lover. She greeted him with smiles and blushes, and when he felt the little clinging hand in his own, that vision of a dark head crowned with yellow flowers vanished out of Mr. Bell's mind. "I have seen the picture, Laurence," whispered Miss Greystone. "Everyone is talking of it. I am so proud of you, so happy I can scarcely tell you what I feel, dear. It is almost too much joy." Her lover slipped the little hand under his arm, and as it rested there he felt it tremble. This was the love that genius might be proud to win. The consciousness of its depth and purity awoke a thrill in the painter's heart as he looked down at the girl's expressive face. The emotion of the moment made her very lovely. She was not the type of a classic heroine. She was not a being of whom to dream, or for whom to go mad. She was a woman made to be trusted and loved. "Yes, the Lady Macbeth is a success, Amy," answered Laurence, as they stood arm in arm before a picture. "And now there is nothing to hinder our marriage. I am on the high road to fortune, darling, and we'll tread it hand in hand." "But if I were to be a hindrance to your success, Laurence? If I were a burden to weigh you down?" "A burden, my sweet one? You don't know how weak I am, and how much I need your love. I fancy myself strong enough to conquer the world when I feel this dear hand upon my arm." While the young lovers walked slowly around the rooms, looking at the pictures and thinking of each other, Madame d'Aspromonte went here and there fitfully, now hurrying across the room to examine something that had attracted her eye, only to turn from it contemptuously after a nearer inspection, now dawdling listlessly before the pictured walls, with her catalogue dangling loosely in her hand, and a disdainful indifference depicted in her countenance. Wherever she went, Mr. Mocatti attended her, deferential, subservient, watchful. An imaginative observer, seeing the two, might have fancied in them some vague resemblance to a splendid lioness and her keeper. The queen of the forest, proud, impetuous, uncertain, dangerous. The keeper, bravely anxious. The princess had scarcely deigned to admire anything when they came to Laurence Bell's picture. "Your exhibition grows worse every year," she said. "Tout est fade, débile, you say. And the same, always the same cornfields, the same sunshine, the same plump, piquant beauties in the reign of your Charles, the same sailor boys in the same boat. Bah! I am tired of it all," cried the princess, shutting her catalogue with a little impetuous gesture. "How does Her Excellency find that?" asked the dealer, pointing to his protégé's picture. Madame looked at it long and steadily, and then flashed her dark eyes upon Mr. Mocatti.
I find that it is a little like me, she said with a touch of anger in her tone.
Exactly what I thought when I first saw the picture, murmured the dealer.
Does the man who did that know me?
He has never seen you until today, except in his dreams. It is a wonderful bit of light and shade, is it not, madame?
For your light and shade, je ne m'en soucie guère, exclaimed the princess. The woman's face is wonderful. Number 126, give me the daggers, she read from her catalogue. Shakespeare. Always your Shakespeare. I must have that picture, Signor Mocatti.
But if it is already sold, Signora.
Qu'est-ce que cela m'en fait? Whether it is sold or not, I must have it all the same. Do I not know with you art is always a question of money? You want a great sum of money for your picture, I suppose. Cheat me as much as you please, Signor Mocatti, but that picture must be mine.
Can I refuse a request so graciously preferred? Murmured the dealer in his mother tongue. The picture shall be yours, madame. Have you no curiosity about the painter?
Your painter is an insolent person, said the princess haughtily.
Because he presumed to dream of beauty he had never beheld? Surely you will not blame him for a coincidence.
Who is he? Asked the lady disdainfully. One of your academicians, I suppose, though his style seems new to me.
His style is very new, and he is not even an associate, as your excellency will perceive if you take the trouble to look at your catalogue. He is a young man called Laurence Bell, and this is his first triumph. He is a protégé of mine, madame, and the triumph is also mine.
Hereupon Mr. Mocatti told the story of the little German genius. In telling it, he took the liberty of an editor, changed the venue from Clerkenwell to Vienna, and transformed his humble protégé into the orphan son of a ruined Austrian officer. The princess deigned to be interested. And what is he like, your protégé? She asked.
Raphael in a modern frock-coat. Raphael at 22. The Raphael whom Buonarroti insulted because he had the retinue of a prince, and looked like a prince.
He ought to succeed, murmured the princess thoughtfully.
He ought, madame, replied the enthusiastic Mocatti. And his success would be a certainty if he had not determined on throwing himself out of a window.
What?
Cried the princess. Pardon, if he had not decided on marrying. It is almost the same thing. And then Mocatti expounded his favorite theory. He will marry, he exclaimed. He will sacrifice his genius on the domestic hearth. His fancy will wither in the vulgar atmosphere of a middle-class home. His finest ideas will take flight at the sound of a tax-gatherer's knock. His grandest aspiration will be annihilated by a water rate. He will be lost to you, to me, to the universe. Oh, madame, it is more than a sacrifice. It is a sacrilege. The divine afflatus was never designed to fan the fire that cooks the domestic dinner. Oh, madame, can we do nothing to prevent this calamity?
Oui, cried the princess, elevating her eyebrows in superb amazement. What have I to do dans cette galère?
Pardon, princesse, murmured the dealer apologetically. I venture to think that if you deigned to express some admiration for the picture, some slight interest in the painter's career, he might be, that is to say, his eyes might be opened to the glorious future that lies before him, and—
Oh, voilà des vraies chimères, exclaimed the princess. At a word from me, the young man is to abandon a fiancée, whom I conclude he loves.
Judge for yourself, princess, said Mr. Mocatti. There they stand, painter and fiancée. As pretty as a picture as any in the room, is it not?
He indicated the spot where Laurence and his betrothed stood side by side, with the sunlight on their faces. It was the last time that they ever stood thus, side by side, in the sunshine, with no shadow of doubt or sorrow between them. Madame d'Aspromonte looked at the two with a prolonged, scrutinizing gaze, Mr. Mocatti watching while she looked.
Very pretty, isn't she? He said presently. Everyone in the rooms has been admiring her.
Everyone has very bad taste, then, remarked the princess, with more than usual nonchalance. The girl is the personification of your English dowdiness, a housemaid, endimanchée.
But surely the face is beautiful, the expression, now as she looks up at her lover, almost seraphic. Is it not, princess?
I know nothing of your seraphs, replied the lady with considerable truth. That girl is evidently consumptive.
And my protégé? May I present him to you?
If you please, assented the princess, in the last extremity of languor. Has he ever painted in fresco?
Oh, ciel, I divine your happy thoughts. The frescoes which you wanted painted for your new music room. The frescoes for which you have so long sought a painter. My princess, he is the man of men. His dreams are all of the classic. They are peopled with gods and goddesses. His ideas are large, sublime, antique. The fancies and aspirations of an appel. And I curb him, poor child. I tie him down. I say, you shall paint me little bits for the houses of Manchester men. Beyond a bishop's half-length your genius shall not soar. His wings are bruised. So much he has beaten them against the bars of his prison house, dear angel. Ah, madame, be yours the hand to break his bondage. Open the cage of this young eagle. Release this chained Prometheus. Let him paint your music room in fresco, concluded Mr. Mocatti, descending from the sublime to the businesslike.
Before I know whether he can paint anything but the wicked glaring woman from your Shakespeare, exclaimed the princess. C'est aller un peu trop vite, Signor Mocatti.
Mr. Bell, cried the dealer, beckoning Laurence across the room. Madame d'Aspromonte does you the honor to admire your picture, and permits me to present you to her.
Yes, I have the pleasure to possess your picture, Mr. Bell, said the princess in her languid, legato, contralto tones. It is very striking. I hope you mean to do even grander things. I see you have studied the Italian painters. I have some very good examples of the Venetian school, which I shall be happy to show you if you care to see them. I am at home every Tuesday evening to receive my friends. She gave him her card as she said this. Princess d'Aspromonte, Adrian's Villa, Fulham. He bowed, murmured some scarcely audible acknowledgment of the lady's graciousness, and returned to the spot where Amy stood watching him. Are you satisfied now, Signor Mocatti? Asked the princess.
Parfaitement, replied the dealer with an ominous smile.
End of section 2. Read by Nova Silva. Section 3 of Circe by Babington White, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Nova Silva. Defection. Mr. Mocatti presented himself in Charnock Street early on the Tuesday after the private view. He found Laurence standing before his easel, working energetically at a new idea, and alone. Exclaimed the dealer. What has become of cette jeunesse? Miss Greystone is in her room, Laurence answered gravely. On vient de se brouiller un peu? Hazarded Mocatti. One has come to do nothing of the kind. Ada was here half an hour ago. But I was absorbed in my work, and a little fretful and impatient, I fear. So she left me. I begin to think it is a mistake to have anyone in the room when one is painting. Cela marche, muttered the dealer. There are several mistaken ideas which you will get rid of in good time, young friend. What is that? He asked, looking at the canvas. Rather hazy at present, but bold and free. It is to be something wilder than the Lady Macbeth, eh, amico mio? Ha ha, the hand shakes a little, he cried, watching the young man as he worked. Put down your brush, and causons un peu. Laurence put aside his brushes and palette with an impatient gesture, and flung himself into a chair. His patron watched with profound satisfaction. Ha ha, he said to himself. He improves. He begins to put himself into passions. His phlegmatic Saxon temperament is aroused at last. The storm and the fire, the rage and the fever are coming, and I shall have a great painter. He seated himself opposite the young man, contemplating him fondly, as a physician might study an interesting patient. Your cheeks are flushed, Laurence, and your eyes are haggard, he said presently. Let me feel your pulse. Ah, that is as it should be. 110 beats in a minute. Le vrai pouls d'un Raphael. My friend, you are going to be a great man. Do you not feel it mounting into your brain, la gloire? Cried the dealer, running his bejeweled hands through his oily black ringlets, as if he too felt his brain fevered by the intoxicating fumes of glory. I feel a sense of hurry, an excitement, an impatience which I never experienced before, answered the painter with a sigh. I am dissatisfied with myself, with my position, with my work. with everything in the world. Oh, Mocatti, is there something poisonous in the intoxication of a first success? I was so tranquil, so happy, before I exhibited that picture. And now—
Enfant! Exclaimed Mr. Mocatti. Do you suppose the grub is not happier coiled snugly in his comfortable cocoon than when he receives his fatal dower of beauty and flies away in the sunlight, bruising his fragile wings against every obstacle until he perishes the prey of a child's cruelty? Do you want to be happy? Burn your palette and brushes, and turn lawyer's clerk or linen draper's shopman. If you want to tread in the footsteps of Raphael, the road lies clear before you.
Mocatti, you know that I live only for my art.
I know nothing of the kind. When you preach to me about tranquility and happiness, art is a storm and passion. If you want to be great, you must bare your breast to the tempest and say to the lightning, strike! Your fortune is made, Laurence. That tide in the affairs of men, of which your Shakespeare talks, it is at its flood for you. And then Mr. Mocatti told his protégé about that spacious music room which the Princess d'Aspromonte intended to have painted in fresco. Figure to yourself, then, mon cher, he cried, yards and yards of gods and goddesses, Amphion, Orpheus, Apollo, et tous les tremblements. Do you not pant to begin? Yes, exclaimed Laurence, his eyes fixed and luminous with the artist's rapture. Yes, Amphion in fresco. That would be grand. The infant brothers, Amphion and Zethus, reared by the shepherds of Mount Cithaeron, the golden lyre given by the god, the blocks of stone and marble, animated with life and motion by those magic strains. I will make a sketch this very day. Oh, Mocatti, shall I ever have such a chance? Do you really think she will let me paint those frescoes? Who knows? Said the Neapolitan with a shrug. Fortune comes to some men in their sleep. And while you have been dozing and dawdling over your sentimental little pot-boilers and your impossible Madonnas with blue porcelain saucers instead of eyes, behold, there comes a princess carrying a laurel crown and a bag of gold, and only asking permission to place one upon your brow and to lay the other at your feet. The chance is in your hands, Laurence. But remember that your princess is capricious and must be courted, or she may carry off her laurels and her gold to some wiser genius. Let me see. Is today not Tuesday? Yes, answered Laurence with a conscious look that was not lost upon his patron. And is it on Tuesday evening the princess receives her friends? Have you a dress coat, mon ami? I bought a dress suit out of the last money you gave me. But do you really think I ought to go so soon? That is for yourself to decide. The Princess d'Aspromonte's invitations seldom go begging, and there are a great many candidates for the honor of painting her music room. I dare say I ought to go, Mocatti, and I see that you wish me to go. I was only thinking— What? Whether Ada would not be hurt by me going to parties without her. I know the dear old governor has a prejudice against fashionable people, and considers a young painter who goes into society on the road to ruin. Poor old Tom Greystone, cried Mr. Mocatti. That is a road to ruin which he has never been invited to tread. He is a very good master, and a better anatomist than half the men who have walked over his poor honest old head. But fashion has passed him by. He has no verve, no fire, no chic, none of that audacity which fascinates the multitude, and he is bitter against the society that has ignored him. Do not listen to him, Laurence. If you want to be great, you must first become popular. The fashion of today is the greatness of tomorrow. It will be a good beginning if you were to forfeit your grand chance in order to stop at home and toast muffins for Miss Greystone and her papa. I think I have seen you toasting muffins. Laurence blushed. Yes, he had been surprised in that degrading act. How often he had knelt on the hearthrug, balancing a muffin on a 2-penny toasting fork, and talking to his sweet Ada, while his sweet Ada's papa dozed on the other side of the hearth. What happy evenings he had spent in the comfortable parlor below the painting room, talking of art and poetry, or jotting down vague fancies in his sketchbook, while Ada played her dreamy waltzes or sang her tender little songs. What bright visions of the future had glorified that common chamber, what divine affection had shone upon the fair face of his betrothed. But at this moment he remembered nothing except that he had toasted muffins, and that it was ignominious to have done so. At what time shall I go to Madame d'Aspromonte's? He asked presently. You had better arrive a little before 10. After 10 her rooms are apt to be crowded. Shall I call for you? If you please. That will be the best plan. Be sure you are ready for me at 9. The drive will take us nearly an hour. Mr. Mocatti departed, and Laurence resumed his pencil. But he found himself disinclined for work, and fancied himself unable to work. So he went in search of Mr. Greystone's well-thumbed classical dictionary, and wasted his morning in reading the stories of Amphion and Orpheus. At 3 o'clock, Ada summoned him to the family dinner of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. He had no appetite, and there seemed to him something revolting in that vulgar salad food. Mr. Greystone dined in his usual hearty manner, and was concerned by his pupil's inability to do justice to the sirloin. "You have been overworking yourself, Laurence," he said. "If you don't take care what you're about, Antonio Mocatti will be the death of you. Your organization is too sensitive to bear being played upon by that man. You are like one of those thoroughbred yearlings that a speculative trainer enters for the Derby. He is trained to win with a great race, and wins it, but never comes in first after that day. Mocatti wants you to make a great hit before you've thrown him off, Lal, and he doesn't care how much it costs you to make it." Ada had been watching her lover anxiously while her father spoke. "Do you think that Laurence is looking ill, Papa?" she asked. "I do," growled the painter. "He has been working too hard, I tell you. He wants fresh air, change, rest. We'll all run down to Windsor by the first train on Sunday morning, and prowl in the forest. The rhododendrons must be in bloom on the road to the Virginia water, and the young rabbits are frisking across the roads with their tails in the air. We'll lunch upon bread and cheese and a bitter beer at the Wheatsheaf, since their dinners are too costly for poor painters, and come back to smoky Babylon in the twilight. Eh, Laurence?" Mr. Bell assented to the proposition, but without enthusiasm. He went listlessly back to the painting room, and took up his palette and brushes. But the sketch that had pleased him in the morning pleased him no longer, and he worked languidly. Ada opened the door, and peeped in at him presently. "I am going for a walk in Regent's Park with Miss Wilson, Laurence," she said, "and Papa says it will do you good to come with us. Will you come, please, dear?" "When am I to work, Ada?" Mr. Bell asked reproachfully. "Papa says you work too much." "And I feel that I achieve nothing. You don't know what it is to have the fancy here, Ada," he cried, striking his forehead, "and yet not have the power to give it form and life there, on the canvas. Oh, my darling, don't think me unkind, but I can't come with you to that Cockney Park, where the trees are all so small and straight and meager, like the little wooden trees in a child's box of toys. I can't endure your friend Miss Wilson with her milliner's apprentice talk about fashions and flounces cut on the bias." "Laurence," said Ada sadly, "it is so unlike you to be impatient." "Yes, I know. I have been dull, sluggish, content to tread the beaten track. But that is over. I have felt what it is to succeed, and I am an altered creature. You know what the critics have said of me. There is the stamp of genius upon my picture, untutored, undeveloped, and I must work. They all preach the same sermon, Ada. Work, work, work. And I feel that I have been idling." "But, dear Laurence, the exhibition only opened yesterday." "Only yesterday? No, but I have wasted time since the day of the private view. And life is much too brief for art. At 18, Raphael had painted the Sposalizio. Surely those Italian painters must have been titans, creatures of another growth, measuring time by another scale, or they could not have achieved such wonders. Oh, my darling, support me and sustain me in every good resolution, I beseech you. I am so weak, so capricious, and I so languish to succeed." He went on to speak to his betrothed about the Princess d'Aspromonte, and the frescoes to be painted on the walls of her music room. Amy listened with a thoughtful countenance, until Laurence was almost inclined to be angry with his betrothed for her lack of enthusiasm. "I thought you would have been pleased to hear of this grand opportunity," he said reproachfully. "Is it a grand opportunity?" asked the girl very earnestly. "Papa has always said that such patronage does a man more harm than good. This Italian lady may be very rich, very liberal, but she is no doubt capricious and difficult to please. Art was never meant to be a woman's plaything, Laurence. You are so weary of Mr. Moccatti's tyranny, and yet you will accept a new bondage from this lady." "My dear girl, you talk like a baby," exclaimed Mr. Bell, with extreme impatience. "I accept no bondage from Madame d'Aspromonte.
She has built a superb apartment which she intends to decorate in the old Italian manner. It is such an opportunity as rarely falls to the lot of an English artist. You know how I despise the paltry subjects I have painted for Mocatti. This commission will give me scope for grandeur, sublimity. If it is in me to be great, Amy, this chance will develop all my powers. But you have never painted in fresco, Laurence. I will learn to paint in fresco, if I get the commission. Mocatti wants me to go with him to Madame d'Aspromonte's villa this evening, and I shall know more about my chances when I have seen her again. There was no promenade in the Regent's Park. Miss Greystone sent an apology to her friend, and spent her afternoon alone in the vacant sitting room, stitching patiently at a pile of her father's shirts, which needed certain restorations of collars and wristbands. The bright May sunshine flooded the shabbily furnished chamber, and transformed the faded crimson curtains into luminous draperies. Miss Greystone's canary sang a paean of praise to the splendid luminary, and Mr. Greystone's French poodle luxuriated in the pleasant warmth. But there was a sharp pain in Amy's breast as she remembered the early May afternoons of the preceding year, when Laurence had thought a ramble in Regent's Park the most delightful recreation, and had been very well pleased to hear Miss Wilson discourse feminine twaddle, while Amy's little hand rested on his arm. Mr. Mocatti is right, she thought to herself despairingly. Genius cannot be shut in a cage. It is mean and cruel of me to judge Laurence his successes, because success takes him away from me. There was no cloud upon Miss Greystone's brow when she presided at the tea-table an hour later, and she took her lover's side of the question when old Tom Greystone pooh-poohed the Princess of Aspromonte and all her set. It is the attribute of a woman to be generous with an aching heart. What would Rubens have done without Albert and Isabella? She said playfully.
Albert and Isabella were a gentleman and lady, replied the old painter savagely. The Princess d'Aspromonte is... Well, I have heard of the lady before today, and my advice to Laurence is, keep clear of her. He has his Odyssey at his fingers' ends, and knows what came to Ulysses when he got into strange company. Mr. Mocatti wishes me to go, murmured Laurence half apologetically. Mocatti has found a goose that lays golden eggs, and he is going to kill his goose in order that he may have all his eggs at once, said Tom Greystone, rising from the table and lighting his dingy old meerschaum. Laurence left the room very soon after this, though Amy had seated herself at the little cottage piano and was playing one of her plaintive waltzes, lingering pensively on the notes. Charnock Street grew dim in the spring twilight as the young man attired himself in his ceremonial costume. The clocks of the neighborhood were striking 9 as he went downstairs, looking his handsomest in that simple evening dress. There was no light in the painting room, but Laurence Bell went there to await his patron, rather than to the chamber below, whence came that low wailing murmur of German waltzes. He loved Amy Greystone very dearly, but he had a vague dread of meeting her tender eyes tonight, lest he should see in them some shadow of reproach. It seemed a very small thing, this visit to the Princess d'Aspromonte, yet he felt as if it were a kind of apostasy. Mr. Moccatti's brougham dashed up to the door at 9:15, flashing 2 fiery eyeballs upon the darkness of Charnock Street. The picture dealer was great in horseflesh, and exhibited his black moustache in the park every afternoon in the season, mounted in a superb mail phaeton. His high-stepping chestnuts pawed the paving stones of Charnock Street impatiently, while the brougham waited, as if conscious that it were not the kind of pavement they were accustomed to. "Let me look at thee, jeune homme," cried the Neapolitan, bouncing into the house like a whirlwind, and meeting Laurence in the lighted passage. "Ah, heaven, thou art perfect! Handsome as Adonis, elegant as a secretary of legation." It was only in moments of extreme satisfaction that the patron was wont to tutoyer his protégé. "Thou hast a latchkey?" he asked. "The princess has a party tonight, and thou wilt be late." No, Laurence Bell had never yet required that unholy privilege. He went into the sitting-room to bid Amy good night, half proud, half ashamed to show himself in his evening dress, and to ask, rather nervously, for Mr. Greystone's latchkey. The girl rose from the piano to look at her lover. "It is true what the art students say, Laurence," she exclaimed. "You are like the old Prince of Raphael." She laid a caressing hand on his arm as she contemplated him admiringly, but withdrew the poor little hand at the sight of Mr. Moccatti's grinning face peering at her from the doorway. He looked like a modern Mephistopheles, waiting for a modern Faust. "N'est pas qu'il est beau, le jeune homme?" cried Mephistopheles. "Fiez-vous à lui, mademoiselle Greystone?" Ce n'est pas la pâte dont on fait les maris. Mais il fera fureur auprès les dames. Laurence asked for the key with which Mr. Greystone was wont to gain admission when he returned late from an artists' club in the neighborhood. Amy gave it to him silently, nor did she appear conscious of the poisoned arrow launched by Mr. Mocatti. Good night, Amy. Good night, Laurence. 2 minutes after this, the fiery chestnuts were tearing westward, like demon steeds newly let loose from the Plutonian stables. End of Section 3. Read by Nova Silva. Section 4 of Circe by Babington White, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Nova Silva. Scene the 4th. Fascination. Vous ne connaissez pas les artistes. Une race puissante et débile tout à la fois. Des imaginations ardentes et mobiles comme la flamme, qui sont attirées irrésistiblement par tout ce qui brille, par tout ce qui caresse l'orgueil, le luxe, le velours, la soie, les fleurs, les mains blanches et leurs mines parfumées de duchesse. Voilà ce qui les fascine, ce qui les damne, ces pauvres enfants. Amidst some half-dozen acres of nobly timbered grounds, which, until 5 years past, had surrounded a red-bricked, pedimented Georgian mansion, the Princess d'Aspromonte had built for herself a classic villa, rich in columns and colonnades, and marble courts wherein bloomed shrubberies of orange and citron. Without and within, the Roman lady's villa was a marvel, and almost fabulous was the sum which the marvel was rumored to have cost in the course of erection. For 3 years, the princess had been the joy of architects, builders, decorators, and landscape gardeners. Quote-unquote extras had fallen from her lips with every word, like jewels in the fairy tale. The richest firms in London had grown richer by her patronage. She had swept with imperious footstep through the halls of Jackson and Graham, ordering cabinets in pietra dura and armoires in Italian marqueterie, as coolly as commoner mortals might order a 3 and 6-penny box of furniture for a doll's house. And the appearance of her stately figure in Christie and Manson's sale-room had put an additional 25% on the value of every object sold. She was the sort of person to take one sweeping glance at a famous collection of pictures and bric-a-brac, and then murmur languidly to the custodian thereof, "You may send me home, tout cela." She had furnished and unfurnished her house 6 times before she was satisfied with its arrangements, and it was only when the villa had consumed more thousands than even the princess cared to remember that she discovered the appalling fact that there was no room in it large enough for music. She was a creature not of impulse, but of impulses, and was possessed by a new mania every season. During the last year her passion had been music, and while the passion was at fever heat, she had built for herself a spacious chamber, constructed in accordance with the last discoveries in the science of acoustics. Before the walls of the room were dry, Madame d'Aspromonte's passion for harmony languished a little, in favor of painting. And having achieved a ceiling which was one gigantic sounding board, she devoted her walls to the sister art. Her dreams were of a chamber glorious with Italian frescoes, and she waited for the advent of the painter. As she deigned neither to take counsel from any creature, nor to act after the manner of ordinary mortals in any event of her life, her selection of a master was likely to be governed ultimately by the caprice of a moment. Mr. Mocatti knew this, and his soul thirsted for the thousands that were to be drawn from that inexhaustible fountain of gold of which the Roman lady was mistress. Tonight, the classic chambers were thronged with such men and women as only fancy had shown to Laurence Bell until now. In those rooms, amidst that glitter of starry gems and starry eyes, in that atmosphere pervaded by a nameless perfume, the young painter felt himself in some strange waking dream. That odor of all-pervading beauty and splendor was more intoxicating to the senses of an artist than the juice of any earthly vine. It was the ichor of the gods. Ah, was he really upon earth tonight? Or was he not rather the dupe of some divine enchantment? Could the dingy brick boxes of Charnock Street and this fairy palace belong to the same planet?
Ah, no. He was Laurence Bell no longer, but Faust, the alchemist. And this grand creature who came out of a crowd of gods and goddesses to greet him with the smile of a welcome must be Helen, the daughter of Jupiter and Nemesis. Surely much folly may be forgiven to a sensitive young man, a being composed of the dreams and fancies which are the seedlings of genius, who finds himself transported all at once into a world which is quite new to him. Is it so strange if his inexperienced eyes mistake the unholy glitter of the lamps that light the halls of Eblis for the divine radiance of the stars, or fashionable beauty, fresh from the restoring hands of her Parisian maid, for the Venus Anadyomene, with the salt-water drops scarcely shaken from her hair? Laurence bowed to the splendid vision that shone before him, which Mr. Mocatti, the picture dealer, greeted without any embarrassment. "I have brought you my young Raphael, princess," he said. "You can have no better cicerone than Signor Mocatti to show you my pictures, Mr. Bell," said the princess very graciously. If she had seemed beautiful to Laurence in her careless morning dress, tonight her splendor appeared to him almost supernal. He was not sufficiently master of his senses to separate her toilette from herself, or to perceive the exact point at which the beauty of the woman left off and the triumph of the milliner began. He knew that Julia d'Aspromonte's figure was the form of a goddess, her eyes the stars of a tropical night, her shoulders the animated marble of a Pygmalion. Her costume tonight affected the gorgeous eccentricity of the Tuileries, rather than the chaste elegance of English fashion. It was a cloud-like mass of white tulle, over which there seemed to be flying tiny tropical birds whose eyes were jewels. Upon her head she wore a coronet of tropical plumage, amidst which blazed a tremulous diamond star, and in her hand she held an Indian fan of the same many-colored plumage. Such a ball dress might Dido or Semiramis have ordered from the milliners of Carthage or Babylon. But this barbaric splendor only came from a masculine manteau-maker in the Rue de la Paix, to whom the princess paid 4,000 or 5,000 a year for a perennial supply of costumes à la Lyon. The rooms were thronged with well-bred men and handsome women. The continental element preponderated, more especially among the women, and the conversation took higher flights than is apt to take in ordinary English society. "The princess poses herself à la Blessington," said Mr. Mocatti to Laurence, in his character of mentor. "Look at her as she talks to that scraggy little man with the bald head and sandy mustache. He is a great German philologist, and she is deep in a conversation as to the authorship of the Odyssey. She is great in Homeric geography, and will tell you the bearings of every island in the Aegean Sea. She takes her stand on Schubarth's theory, and insists that the Epic of the Greeks was written by a Trojan. Les femmes s'accrocheront toujours à toute espèce de paradoxe, et c'est la plus femme des femmes. You see that dark, yellow-faced man pushing his way to her? That is Carlo Venturini, the Italian patriot. She will drop Homer and plunge into Italian politics in the wink of an eye. And then she will discuss the Darwinian philosophy, the second Faust, the topography of Carthage, the authenticity of the last batch of Marie Antoinette's private correspondence, Émile Augier's last comedy, George Sand's last novel. Tout ce que vous voudrez. A wonderful woman, n'est-ce pas, mon ami?" Laurence Bell's lips uttered no reply, but his eyes followed the princess as she turned from one guest to another, and they said enough for Mr. Mocatti. "And now I will show you the house," said the dealer. "Nice, isn't it? This is the atrium. Observe the silver shrine for the Penates yonder in the corner. Note those candelabras in bronze by Barbadienne, 5 feet high, copied from a pair found at Pompeii. Doors plated with Corinthian brass and ivy. Mosaic pavement representing groups of gladiators. A pretty feminine fancy, isn't it? And thoroughly classical. From the atrium we pass into the cavadium, and you will have to learn the classic names of the chambers si vous voulez entrer dans les bonnes grâces de la princesse, mon ami. Here we have statues, and colonnade in Luna marble, compluvium in jasper and porphyry. Yonder, to the left, is a spharisterium, tennis courts, gymnasium, anything you like. And now we will go and look at the pictures. Vous me direz des nouvelles. Mr. Mocatti led his protégé beneath colonnades in which Sallust might have loitered among flute-players and flatterers. Statues gleamed whitely in the uncertain light, and in the midst of the court Laurence beheld a wide porphyry basin, in which the water looked black and deep under the stars.
Beyond this quadrangle there was a curtained door, through which the two men passed into the antechamber hung with black velvet, whereon were emblazoned the arms and mottos of the Aspromontes, for here the princess had elected to be Elizabethan. The antechamber opened into a long gallery, hung from floor to ceiling with pictures, and here Mr. Mocatti left Laurence to his own devices, having interests of his own to be furthered amongst the guests of the princess. Laurence lingered long among the pictures. The atmosphere of the saloon had been almost stifling to him, and it was a relief to be alone. In the center of the gallery there was a portrait of the princess, painted en buste, mounted on a gilded stand, and hung with dark green velvet. The head was finely painted by a daring hand, and in the eyes the painter had kindled a light which was not the seraphic radiance. Laurence knelt on a tapestried prie-dieu opposite the picture, and abandoned himself to the contemplation of that darkly splendid face. "Yes, she is like my Lady Macbeth," he said to himself. "What a face for a painter! By what strange fatality did it haunt my dreams until it grew into life upon my easel? Shall I ever forget it now that its strange charm has once possessed me? Not a face to love. No, no, no. But a face to dream of, a face to paint, a face to develop the latent genius of him who paints it. What a rude sketch that portrait is, though one can see that it is the work of a master hand. If the princess would only sit to me, if she would let me study her face line by line, shape my genius in the mold of her beauty, ah, then I might achieve a picture that would live forever, like Raphael's Fornarina, like Guido's Beatrice Cenci. After all, it is the woman who gives immortality to the painter, and not the painter who immortalizes the woman." He abandoned himself to a delicious dream, in which he fancied himself the painter of a portrait, only a portrait, which should be the wonder of the art world. He imagined the praises of critics, who agreed that the golden age of painting had come back all at once, and that there had arisen a young man worthy to rank with Raphael and Guido. Had he done wrong in coming to this woman's house? Ah, no, surely. For he felt that a fire was kindled in his breast that had never burned there before, and he told himself that it was the glow of that volcano men call genius. "Mocatti is right," he said to himself. "I have been a dawdler, a tradesman, painting for my daily bread. It is now for the first time I feel what ambition means. The fever, the insatiable longing, the thirst which is akin to agony. Oh, heaven! To be great at any cost, by any ordeal, to paint one great picture which should stamp itself upon the minds of all nations for ever and ever in the years to come. Such things have been. What was Raphael, that no new Raphael should ever be born amongst men? Was there a fiercer fire in his breast than that which burns in mine? Was he more ready to sell his life for art than I am to sacrifice mine? No. I have set my lips to the cup of success, and I will drink deeply of that godlike draught, or die." He was 22, mad, foolish if you will. He had been flattered by his patron, praised by his master, honest, outspoken Thomas Greystone, and worshipped by a romantic girl. As he knelt before Julia d'Aspromonte's portrait, he fancied that it was in him to become a second Raphael. And kneeling thus, as if in homage, before that unholy shrine, was there falsehood towards Amy Greystone in his heart? No. The intoxication which possessed him was not the influence of love. It was the artist, not the lover, who was enthralled by this woman's picturesque beauty. A soft, trainante voice startled Laurence from his reverie. "What do you think of my picture, Mr. Bell?" The painter looked up and beheld Madame d'Aspromonte standing by his side, looking down at him with her glorious Italian eyes. He would have started to his feet, but she laid her hand lightly on his arm. "Do not be so eager to rise," she said, smiling. "Your attitude is a most delightful flattery. Do you like my portrait? It is considered one of the chefs-d'œuvre of poor Ingress." "It is not grand enough, or beautiful enough," cried Laurence, emboldened by her easy manner, half patronage, half admiration. "And yet it is both grand and beautiful," he murmured, with dreamy eyes fixed on the canvas. "Ah, madame, if you would permit me to paint your picture—" "Perhaps some day I may be induced to grant you that privilege," replied the princess, smiling at his enthusiasm.
but I warn you that I am a most intolerable sitter. So, you think you could paint a better portrait than in Grace? You have at least daring. And I think you have genius, she added very softly, after a pause and a long scrutinizing look at the young face gazing upward to her own with such profound admiration. Yes, I think you have genius, she repeated in a thoughtful tone. And you shall paint my picture. I will sit to you more patiently than I sat to poor Grace. Yours is another kind of genius, Mr. Bell. Tender, plastic, a genius that must be cherished and warmed into life in an atmosphere of perpetual summer. Not a genius to climb mountain peaks and bare its brow to the hurricane. It is an exotic blossom, and must inhabit a hothouse. Yes, you shall paint my picture. Madame! The exclamation expressed wonder, rapture, gratitude, self-abasement. Laurence was still kneeling on the prie-dieu chair, still looking upward with reverential eyes at the face of this gracious divinity. Genius, murmured the princess, the real fire of Prometheus. Ah, what happiness to see the godlike flame brighten in the lamp of clay. You do not know how I have worshipped genius, Laurence Bell. How my dreams have been peopled by the shadows of the mighty dead. How my soul has yearned for communion with the heaven-gifted souls of the living. I have gathered around me all that is brightest in art and poetry. But to see genius in its celestial dawn, to foster the fitful flame with my own hands, that would be a delight beyond all parallel. Yes, that is the new joy which the despot Sybarite should have found for himself when he had exhausted all earth's common pleasures. She paused, with her hands clasped, resting on the back of the chair. Her eyes fixed on the painter's face, with as rapt a gaze as if they had been indeed watching the growing brightness of some supernal flame. Laurence was silent, transfixed by that gaze. His loosely falling hair drooped over the clasped hands of the princess as he looked upward to her thoughtful face. You shall paint my portrait, Mr. Bell, she said in a lighter tone, and if that is a success, you alone shall paint my frescoes. Signor Mocatti has pleaded your cause very earnestly since I saw you at the academy, and I am inclined to be governed by his advice. You need paint for money no longer. I am rich, and my banker shall be yours till the frescoes are completed, when the exorbitant Mocatti will know how to make his own bargain. Her bracelet struck against his brow as she withdrew her clasped hands from the chair on which they had rested. The band of gold and gems felt hard and cold, and hurt him as it struck. The sudden change in Madame d'Aspromonte's manner seemed to him hard and cold, like the bracelet, and inflicted a sharper pain than the blow. I must return to my friends, Mr. Bell, she said. They were waltzing when I left the room, and the waltz must be over now. You can come with me if you like. Remember, from tonight you are to paint only for fame, and for me. She led the way through the anteroom and quadrangle, and Laurence followed her back to the long drawing-room. Here the dancing was suspended, and a German professor was achieving wonders on a newly invented instrument, which was at once organ and piano. The princess seated herself on an ottoman, and her satellites flocked round her, hiding her completely from the eyes of Laurence Bell, the painter of Charnock Street. He saw men with stars and ribbons on their breasts, men in semi-official costume, men who bore the stamp of military rank in every careless movement, men in whom the blue blood made itself evident even to the unaccustomed eyes of Laurence Bell. Of the women, he only knew that all were elegant, and many beautiful. For the rest, he felt that the scene in which he found himself was like a glimpse of a new world, and that it pained him to remember how soon he must return to the old one. Mr. Mocatti circulated among the fashionable guests quite at his ease. People who would have been outraged by his presence in an English house accepted the fact here as an eccentricity peculiar to the continental mind. Had not a distinguished photographer been seen of late years to disport himself at an ambassador's ball, offering himself as a partner in the waltz to high-born damsels, from whom he would have been happy to earn a guinea the next morning? The signor found Laurence standing unnoticed amidst a covey of secretaries of legation, who were grouped in a doorway, ready to rise at the opening bar of the next waltz. Eh bien, mon ami, he said cheerily. Vous avez déjà l'air du pays.
How do you like Adrian's villa? People have been asking me questions about you, and you are known as the painter of the Lady Macbeth. You may come here every Tuesday evening if you choose. Perhaps now we shall hear no more of cette jeunesse." Laurence Bell seemed unconscious of this last remark. "I am to paint the frescoes, Mocatti," he exclaimed. "The princess has told me as much with her own lips. If I have indeed to thank you for this, I thank you with my whole heart." He wrung the Neapolitan's hand in both his own as he said this. Mr. Mocatti looked at him with an expression which was not unmingled with pity. "The divine spark has taken fire," said the dealer. "You will paint great pictures." "The princess is talking of you to Sir Edgar Robehoven. See, she looks this way. She is beckoning you. Go, and be presented to the great academician." The young man's face lighted up as he obeyed the summons of his patroness. Antonio Mocatti looked after him with a thoughtful smile. "You have to thank my diplomacy a little, Mr. Bell," he said to himself. "But you also have to thank your own pretty face, and the caprice of a woman more capricious than the cloud and sunshine of your murderous English Aprils and Mays."
End of Section 4. Read by Nova Silva. Section 5 of Circe by Babington White, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Nova Silva. Scene the 5th. Repudiation. Art's a service mark. A silver key is given to thy clasp, and thou shalt stand, unwearied night and day, and fix it in the hard, slow-turning wards, and open in that intermediate door betwixt the different planes of sensuous form and forms unsensuous. The flood tide of success had come, and it swept Laurence onward at its will with the force of a maelstrom. Before the month of May was ended, Thomas Greystone knew that his pupil was lost to him, and Amy wept in secret over the defection of her lover. It was not that he had committed an overt act of inconstancy. He still painted in the big bare chamber in Charnock Street. He still occupied his old place at the painter's modest dinner table. He still rendered to Amy Greystone some portion of that homage which is the legitimate right of an affianced wife. But the change in him was none the less complete, because he had not yet shaken himself free of his old surroundings. The butterfly had spread his splendid wings, and if some remnants of the shattered cocoon that had been his prison house still hung about him, he only waited the fitting moment to throw them off forever. Amy endured her sorrow in silence. Her lover no longer talked of the future which those two had hoped to share. He talked of nothing but his art, his hopes, his fears, his ambition. He had become all at once the very incarnation of egotism. He who so lately had been interested in every bonnet ribbon chosen by his affianced wife was now so absorbed in his own daydreams as to scarcely be conscious of her presence, except when she came between him and the light. That guardian angel of youthful genius, Mr. Mocatti, hovered about the house in Charnock Street in a state of mind-approaching rapture. His stalwart arm had rescued his protégé from the muddy vortex of domestic life, and instead of little bits of genre painting worth 25 guineas, the patron and proprietor could now hope to behold those wild flights of art which make the world aghast with wonder or delight, and necessitate substantial evidences of triumph in the shape of a railing and a policeman to ward off an enraptured crowd of starers. "Ah, thank heaven!" cried the sentimental Neapolitan. "Thou hast elevated thyself above that quagmire of butchers' bills and perambulators. Thou dreamest no longer of a cottage at Camberwell, where the walls would not be thick enough to muffle the screams of thy teeth-cutting children, and where thy finest fancies would be startled by the sound of shrill tradesmen's boys shrieking, 'Yep!'" Mr. Bell no longer protested against his patron's anti-matrimonial ideas. "I shall not marry till I have made myself a name," he said. "I begin to think there is some truth in what you say. My affection for Miss Greystone is unalterable, and will be all the better for keeping." "Comme les vins de meilleur cru," said Mocatti. The young painter had now very few mornings to spare for sober drudgery in the Charnock Street painting room. Mr. Greystone plodded steadily on at the bread and cheese of his art, but the enthusiastic talk of his pupil and fellow worker no longer cheered him as he stood before his easel. He shook his head doubtfully when friends and brothers of the brush asked after Laurence. "He has had the misfortune to make a success," he said dryly.
and he has had the still greater misfortune to find an aristocratic patroness. You must go and ask your way to some swell villa out at North End if you want to find Laurence Bell, and he rarely condescends to honor this house with his presence nowadays."
Yes, before the June roses were in bloom, it had come to this. Laurence spent the greater part of his life at Adrian's villa. The princess had given him her music room for his studio, and here was already set up an easel on which Mr. Bell was to paint his sketches for the frescoes. She was as generous as the godmother of a fairy tale. When first her protégé beheld the music room, it was a great bare chamber, with plastered walls and undraperied windows. "It shall be your painting room," cried the princess. "Bring your easels and paraphernalia in a day or two, and everything shall be ready for you." The painter would have protested, but she stopped him with her accustomed gesture à la Semiramis. "You must make your sketches here," she said. "You have no idea how difficult to please I shall be about these frescoes. I want to have my part in the painter's triumph and to say, 'It was I who inspired that expression. It was I who suggested that detail.' You must have this room, Mr. Bell. You can bring your Mr. Greystone here also, if you please, and he can work at your backgrounds." Laurence knew that Thomas Greystone was the very last of men to undertake the paintings and backgrounds for his late pupil, but he did venture to make some kind of proposal to his friend and master. He offered to share the commission with the plodding old painter. "The princess wants her rooms finished in a year," he said, "and there must be more work than I could do in 3. Why shouldn't we work together, Greystone?"
"I am not a great man, Mr. Bell, nor do I ever hope to be one," answered the painter gravely. "But before I would prostitute my small abilities to the caprices of your princess, I would put on a little red jacket, which would be far from becoming to my middle-aged figure, and kneel down in the street to black shoes at a penny's pair. Do you know what a greater lady than your Roman princess said when a sketch of William Eddy's was shown to her? 'Take the thing away,' she cried in disgust. 'The poor man doesn't know what we want.' And the thing was put in a shed where it rotted, and the poor man was offered 40 lire for his work. That is what aristocratic patronage means in England, Mr. Bell, and I am one who will have none of it. Besides which," added the painter rather sadly, "you and I have done with each other now. You have learnt more than I ever taught you, and you belong to Antonio Mocatti. He has created you, and he will have his value out of you."
"How can you say that we have done with each other, dear old friend?" cried Laurence, "when I am looking forward to the day in which I shall call you father."
"Ah," sighed Mr. Greystone, "go on looking forward. That day is a long way off."
This was said in an undertone and was unheard by Laurence. His fancies had taken wing, and they were among those denizens of Olympus with whom a man who paints in fresco must hold frequent converse. When he went again to the villa at Fulham, he found the music room hung with amber damask and carpeted with purple velvet pile. Marbles and bronzes, Florentine mosaics, and Flemish carved oak furniture have been arranged in the apartment with that perfect taste which knows how to achieve the semblance of carelessness as the result of care. Wherever the young man's eyes rested, they fell on a gem. Here a jasper vase, there a bronze Hercules, with the Cretan bull prostrate and helpless in the grip of his conqueror. Anon, a single cup and saucer in Sèvres, bought for 51 guineas and a half in Philip's sale-room, and bought in the teeth of Mr. von Ston, a great publisher and collector, who had vowed to himself a vow that he would never go beyond 50. Laurence Bell surveyed the apartment with bewildered eyes, while the princess watched him, amused by his astonishment, and while Mr. Mocatti rubbed his hands in the background, always more or less like Mephistopheles. "Vous voilà, tout ébloui," exclaimed the princess. "Did you think that I should ask you to paint in a room with bare floors and plastered walls? No, Mr. Bell. I know that to art beautiful surroundings are as necessary as the sunshine and air to my flowers yonder." Mr. Mocatti thought of Hemling, the convalescent, painting a certain chasse in the hospital of Bruges, of Poussin and his carrot, but he held his peace. "This room is to be yours until the sketches are completed, Mr. Bell," said the princess, when the painter had murmured some half-audible expression of his rapture and gratitude. "And then I suppose we must unfurnish it again before you begin your frescoes. In the meantime, remember, it is you who are at home here, and I who am the visitor. The room is detached from my villa, as you see, and the only communication is through that orangery. Lock the doors of the orangery,
and vous êtes chez vous. What could the painter say in acknowledgment of so much graciousness? Had he been 10 years older and wiser, he might have rejected such a weight of obligation from a woman's fair hand. But he was only 22 years of age, inexperienced, imaginative, sensitive, credulous, and he was as plastic as wax in the hands of this imperious beauty. He who had been so lately an obscure student, toiling patiently among other students, might well be intoxicated by such subtle flattery. His head was turned. He thought of Tasso and Leonora, of Chastelard and Mary Stuart, of anything and everything except his plighted life and his own independence as a man. After this, he went almost daily to Adrian's villa. On some days, Madame d'Aspromonte was from home or otherwise invisible, and he came and departed without seeing her. And on those days he worked tolerably well. On other days, she would come in and out of his painting room, as Amy Greystone herself might have done, except that she was less considerate of his labors than Amy had been, and very careless as to the waste of his time. She would sit in one of the medieval chairs talking of art in her own wild, fitful way, or would order her box of watercolors to be brought, and establish herself in one of the windows. She was an accomplished amateur in this, and in every other art, as it seemed to Laurence. It was delightful to him to look over her shoulder now and then as she worked, and on these days the sketch upon his own easel made small progress. Thus, little by little, Amy Greystone's lover was lured away from Charnock Street. On some evenings he dined at the villa. He attended the weekly receptions of his patroness. He was invited by people whom he met at those receptions. He had a place in Madame d'Aspromonte's opera box for all the best performances at either house. And he had, therefore, few unoccupied evenings to moon away amidst the dusky shabbiness of the Fitzroy Faubourg. The few evenings which he did pass in Mr. Greystone's household seemed long and wearisome. The drowsy quiet of the house weighed upon his spirits. The sordid ugliness of the furniture was an actual torture to his sensuous soul. He languished for the lights and the perfume, the feast of form and color which awaited him at the Fulham villa. It was not that Amy Greystone was less loving and lovable, or that he had ceased to value her love or admire her beauty. He loved her still, but he loved her as a drunkard or a gambler loves the fair young wife whom he abandons night after night for the delights of the tavern or the gaming table. At Adrian's villa, the painter found an intoxication worse than wine, and having tasted the fiery spirit, he could find no further delight in sober pleasures. His friends in Charnock Street saw how it was with him, and felt his defection according to their different natures. Amy accepted the decree of fate with sublime resignation. He was hers no longer, this genius she had worshipped and loved. He belonged to the universe, to the future, to all time to come. What was she, that she should fling herself across his pathway and cry, "Stay with me, you are mine"? She bowed her head and relinquished her lover, sacrificing her happiness to his glory, as she would have sacrificed her life for his pleasure had need been. If by any hazard he made some careless allusion to the future in which she was to be his wife, she smiled faintly, and her smile was beautiful to behold. But it was the smile of a martyr. Tom Greystone contemplated events from a very different point of view. He was indignant with his quondam pupil, though he gave no direct utterance to his indignation. Had he not sufficient cause for that silent rage which consumed him, when he saw his only child's face grow paler day by day, and a wan, sad look in the eyes that had so lately beamed with hope and happiness? For some time, there was a lowering cloud upon the painter's brow, and those evenings which Laurence Bell spent at home were painful to more than one. Amy knew that her father was angry, and that all her tenderness and patient management would be needed to ward off the threatened storm. She was her lover's protector and champion through all that bitter time, defending him à tort et à travers, with a breaking heart, and Laurence Bell had no consciousness of her nobility or his own meanness. The intoxication which possessed him was a blind, mad drunkenness in its way. He thought of nothing except his success of the present and the future. He was to be great. Mocatti, the enthusiast and trader, had said so. The princess had told him the same. She, who was a genius herself, and must, therefore, possess the divine gift of understanding the genius of others.
He was aroused as by the touch of a magic wand from that dull, patient industry which had been a kind of sloth. The blood that flowed so slowly in his veins was changed to fire. He was consumed by fever and impatience. He was fretful, capricious, irritable, intolerant of small annoyances, disgusted with the common course of everyday life. This was a part of his divine heritage. This was the penalty of genius. One day, the storm burst. It was Amy's birthday, and the painter had planned a little festival. He had ordered a fly from the livery stables, and intended to take his daughter and his pupil to dine at the Spaniards. Mr. Greystone only announced his intention at the breakfast table. He took it for granted that Laurence, even in these days of defection, would be pleased to pay some tribute to the occasion.
"You seem to forget that it is somebody's birthday, Lal," said the painter in a more cordial tone than he had of late taken with his pupil. Laurence looked up from his untasted breakfast with a vacant stare. "Birthday?" he said. "Oh, some of the royal family, I suppose. They are always having birthdays. What day is it, by the by? I haven't written a letter for an age." "I think you might have remembered the 29th of June without the aid of letter writing," retorted Mr. Greystone sharply. The angel in the house was quick to the rescue. "Laurence works too hard to remember dates," she said. "It is only clerks and shopkeepers who want to know the day of the month." "He might have remembered your birthday," answered the offended father. "Amy's birthday! Ah, to be sure, the 29th! And I have nothing to give you!" exclaimed the young man, aroused at last. "Never mind, Amy. I may be able to make you a noble birthday gift next year if my pictures are successful." "Give me one leaf from your laurel crown, dear, and I shall be quite satisfied," the girl said gently. "Laurel fiddlesticks," growled Tom Greystone. "Consider yourself lucky if the young man can give you a 10 and 6 penny pencil case. When a painter begins life by wasting his nights at parties and his days in dancing attendance upon a woman of fashion, one can make a tolerable guess as to the result. However, I don't want to grumble today, Lal. You're young and foolish, and I suppose we mustn't be surprised if the tall talk about your glowering woman with the carving knives has done you a little mischief. Wait till next year, when you exhibit another glowering woman, and the critics say you have repeated yourself, or exhibit a simpering woman, and are told that you have missed the fire and dash so remarkable in your work of promise. Well, I mustn't quarrel with him if he gathers his roses while he may, must I, dear?" said the painter, nodding at his daughter. "I'll tell you what I'm going to do for you, Lal, in honor of this little girl's 19th anniversary. I'm going to give you a Cockney holiday, a drive by Finchley and Highgate, and chicken and moselle at the Spaniards, and you shall talk poetical nonsense to Amy while we drive homeward in the moonlight, when the lamps in all the villas are twinkling gaily, and the tired organ grinders are going home to their kennels behind Hatton Garden." Laurence Bell's fair Raphael face flushed crimson. "I should have liked it of all things," he said. But, roared Thomas Greystone in a voice of thunder. "Is there such a word as but on my girl's birthday?" "You must know how I should have liked to be with you, Amy," pleaded Laurence, with an appealing look at his sweetheart. "But I forgot today would be the 29th, and I promised Mocatti and the princess to dine at the Star and Garter, where there is to be a kind of artistic gathering. Sir Edgar Verbehoven and young Curtius Rock, the Monmouth after the Marston Moor man, you know, and—" "You can break your promise to Mr. Mocatti on my girl's birthday," interrupted Mr. Greystone sternly. "No, Papa. He shall not break it," cried Amy, rising suddenly from that humble breakfast table and hurrying towards the door. "He shall not break his promise to the princess, for I know he would rather keep it." It was the first time she had ever been angry with her lover. Laurence looked at her in amazement. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes kindled as she spoke. But before he could stop her, she had left the room. She ran upstairs to her own sanctuary, a small apartment overlooking dreary leads and chimneys, and here she fell on her knees by the little bed and abandoned herself to her despair. It was a very real despair, though it was only a girl's first sorrow. She remembered her last birthday, celebrated by no grand festival,
A hopelessly wet day, dreary and dull beyond all measure. But oh, how happy she had been, wasting the hours in the painting room, while Laurence and her father lounged over their work. What a cheery little dinner they had eaten together, with a bottle of sparkling wine opened in her honor, and what merry talk and laughter there had been, while the wine was being drunk. In the evening, they had all gone to a theater to witness some clumsy adaptation of a flimsy Odeon comedy, and Papa had been betrayed into slumber before the piece was finished. And Laurence had drawn his chair close to hers to talk nonsense, which, to that one fair critic, had seemed wittier than all the smart Gallicisms that illumined the play. She remembered all this today, as she knelt beside her bed, and the remembrance stung her keenly. Tom Greystone turned fiercely upon his pupil as Amy left the room.
"Now, sir," he cried, "the sooner this farce is ended, the better."
"What farce?"
"Your residence in this house. Your position as my daughter's lover."
"My dear Mr. Greystone," remonstrated Laurence, "you surely don't suppose that I am the less attached to my dearest Amy because I accept an invitation to Richmond?"
"No, Mr. Bell. But because you have begun a life of Richmond dinners, because you have sold yourself to the devil, as the man in the old story sold himself. You have got your price. Make the most of it. No daughter of mine shall sacrifice her young existence to the unpaid drudgery of matrimony, unless the heart of the man who sues for her is honest and true to the core. Yours is not. You have chosen your course. If you want a wife, look for one in your patroness, your Roman princess, your Madame d'Aspromonte." "I beg, Mr. Greystone, that you will respect the name of that lady," cried Laurence, growing suddenly pale. "Is the wound so deep already?" said the old painter, half in irony, half in sadness. "Well, well. Let me remember that you are young and foolish. Perhaps it is better as it is. I know very little of your princess, except that nobody seems to know much about her. And that in itself is sometimes considered evidence against a lady. She calls herself the widow of a Roman banker, and she spends so much money that it is to be hoped the banker was a Rothschild. It is her caprice to patronize art and artists. Her parties are agreeable, and her guests are legion. But though you may find charming women among her acquaintance, you will find no woman of marked position in the great world. This is all I have ever heard, for or against your princess, and this is all I have to say of her. And now, Mr. Bell, the sooner you and I bid goodbye to each other, the better."
"Do you mean this, Mr. Greystone?" asked the young man.
"Most emphatically."
"And Amy?"
"Amy Greystone shall never speak to you again with my leave," answered the old painter. "You have chosen your road. Take it and keep to it. I and my daughter resign our claims upon you."
"As you please, Mr. Greystone," replied Laurence. He flung himself out of the room, took his hat from a peg in the passage, and went out of the house that had sheltered him for 10 years of his life. This was his farewell to boyhood and youth. He hailed the first empty cab he encountered, and drove straight to Pelham Lodge, where he found the great Mocatti attired in a gorgeous velvet morning gown, dipping his fork meditatively into a Strasbourg pie en terrine. To him, Mr. Bell related the unjustifiable conduct of Mr. Thomas Greystone. "Thou hast done well to escape from their clutches," cried the dealer. "It was one thing to learn the ABC of thine art from plotting old Thomas Greystone. It is another thing to marry his daughter. And so thou hast left Charnock Street for always. It was high time. The great world has begun to be aware of thee, and the great world will not direct its notices of invitation to Charnock Street. I will find thee an apartment de garçon at the West End. For tonight thou canst sleep in this house." Laurence Bell submitted to his destiny. He kept his appointment at Richmond, whither he travelled very comfortably in Mr. Moccatti's mail phaeton. The dinner was a brilliant success, and amongst the guests of Madame d'Aspromonte, Mr. Bell forgot that it was Amy's birthday, and that his presence at that banquet was a kind of treason. He thought of Amy as he drove homeward in the moonlight. It may be that he was scarcely sorry to be free from a yoke that had begun to be galling to him. He believed himself still true to his love, but he was not the less tired of Charnock Street. And it was with a sense of relief that he found himself outside the dull old house which had sheltered him so long, and remembered that he had no occasion to enter it again. He wrote Miss Greystone a long letter before he slept that night, full of passionate protestations of truth and constancy, interspersed with feverish rhapsody about that laurel crown which was to be laid at the young lady's feet by and by. It was the sort of letter that can only be written by a man who feels and believes all he writes, while writing it. And it was the sort of letter which is almost invariably belied by the after-conduct of the writer. Laurence Bell blotted the manuscript with his tears. He kissed the name which he had written at the top of the page, and then, having addressed and sealed his letter, he threw himself down to sleep, worn out by the day's excitement, and dreamt of Julia d'Aspromonte. He awaited a reply to this letter, but did not await it very impatiently, for the princess absorbed the greater part of his time and thought. Mr. Mocatti gave him a cheque for £125, just half the amount paid by Madame d'Aspromonte for the Lady Macbeth, and with this small capital, he felt himself secure from all sordid cares. The same kind friend and mentor introduced him to a crack tailor, and found him a couple of pretty little rooms on a second floor in North Audley Street, une vraie nid de Gandin, as the mentor said, with the daintiest chintz draperies lined with pink, and the most luxurious of easy-chairs. Having established his protégé in this delightful nest, Mr. Mocatti bade him farewell prior to his departure for a scamper through the Continental Art Exhibitions with an eye to business. "If you want more money before I come back, you will draw upon me," he said in his farewell interview. "I have no fear of your future. The princess will make you fashionable, and to be fashionable nowadays is to be great. I do not say that Madame d'Aspromonte has any real position amongst your insular noblesse, with their grand airs of exclusiveness, but in a certain circle she is a kind of queen, and when people know you are painting for her, you will have plenty of commissions. The frescoes will give you a great chance, for they will be talked of everywhere. And now adieu, and remember my hopes of thee. I have set thee on the high road to the temple of fame. C'est à toi d'y arriver à pas d'aiguillon." Upon this, Mr. Mocatti embraced, or would have embraced, his protégé, wiped away a tear with one finger of his irreproachable glove, and departed, leaving the young man to his all-absorbing dream of success, and to the tender mercies of his patroness. And thus ended the first act in the career of Laurence Bell, the painter. End of Section 5. Read by Nova Silva. Section 6 of Circe by Babington White, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Nova Silva. Act the Second. Quem Deus vult pedere, prius dementat. Scene the First. Thraldom. Si l'on vous dit que l'art et que la poésie, c'est un flux éternel de banale ambroisie, que c'est le bruit, la foule attachée à vos pas, ou d'un salon doré l'oisive fantaisie, ou la rime en foyant par la rime saisie. Oh, ne le croyez pas. The June roses grew pale in the feverish noontides of July. The summer, so newly begun, already seemed waning, and the denizens of western London were on the wing, pleased to find the labors of the season ended, and prompt to seek fairer habitations in the stuccoed palaces of South Kensington. The cornfields were changed to lakes of rippling gold, and the London season was over. To Laurence Bell, that London season had been one brief night of enchantment, a daydream in a sunny garden, a wild, bewildering vision after a masquerade supper, a delightful piece of diablerie, anything rather than the sober reality which he had hitherto known as life. Was this because, quote, love took up the glass of time and turned it in his glowing hands, end quote? Ah, no, surely not because of that alone. For love had turned the glass before today, and the quiet evenings in Charnock Street had passed very quickly through his influence. The hours had glided past the two lovers with gentle footsteps, like noiseless waters past a drifting boat. But now, the hours seemed feverish, and drunken as with strong wine. They danced and hurried onward, in an intoxicating measure that knew neither rest nor respite. The painter lost his hold upon time, and at night, when he looked back at the day that was done, he marveled to find what a feather he had been upon the resistless current that had carried him onward. He was drifting down no common river. The stream which bore him upon its capricious waters had falls gigantic as Niagara, whirlpools as profound as the great northern maelstrom. What could he do but suffer himself to be dashed headlong down the cataracts, or engulfed in the whirlpools, according to the sweet will of his Eumenides, and be thankful if there were any remnant of life left in him when the ordeal was past? Mr. Bell did submit himself unquestioningly to his fate. Whether the influence which had subjugated his plastic soul were angelic or demoniac was a question he did not care to ask himself. Youth is not given to self-analysis. It is supremely unconscious of its own follies, slow to suspect itself as it is to suspect others. Of himself and his own life, Laurence Bell had little knowledge. He knew that his hopes of future glory and future happiness lay in the rosy palm of a woman's hand. He did not know that the woman would have crushed them with as little compunction as if those bright hopes and aspirations of genius and youth had been a handful of faded rose leaves. Fame had come to him, Fame the goddess, or perhaps only that subordinate being, inhabitant of some middle region between this dull earth and the Olympian clouds, that smooth-faced, smiling enchantress called popularity. She who sets a stage garland of painted calico upon the brow of aspiring genius instead of the eternal bay leaves. But to genius himself, the enchantress who brings the garland is always a goddess, the wreath always of immortal growth. Public recognition, the praise of critics, the caresses of connoisseurs and dilettanti, had come to the struggling painter of Charnock Street. Those blessings which a few months ago had seemed to him remote possibilities, visionary delights, glimmering star-like far away in the cloudland of the future, prizes which, if fortune favored him, might come to him when he was stout and gray and grizzly, like dear old Tom Greystone, as the reward due for a life of patient industry. And behold, without an effort, by one lucky inspiration vigorously interpreted, he had attained the desire of his life. He had won all, and had lost the woman who was to have been his wife. Did he think of this when he counted his gains? Well, you see, his existence of late had been so wild a fever that he had no leisure in which to count his gains, or to remember his losses. Have you ever watched the caresses which capricious beauty lavishes on her Maltese spaniel, and envied the creature his favored destiny? To be near her, at her feet, to feel the touch of her soft hand, to have one's face swept by her perfumed hair, her own hair, bien entendu, and not the purchased tresses from the unsophisticated beauties of Moldavia or Bokhara, from the dark-eyed peasant girls of Brittany or the gray-eyed sirens of Southern Ireland. What a delightful fate! What a privileged existence! And yet, would beauty's most devoted worshipper accept the sweet slavery? To lie at her feet all through the summer's day? Ah, what rapture! But in the evening the favored slave might be seized with a fancy for going to his club, or might remember a very special appointment with Fitzjones of the Jockey Club, made with a view to squaring up after the Chester Cup or the Leger. Laurence Bell had assumed the delicious bondage, and had yet to discover that chains are not pleasant wear, even when made of roses. Just now the roses retained all their freshness, and the thorns were in abeyance. So, if Mr. Bell was not quite happy, he did not know himself to be unhappy, and that is the negative stage of happiness. Never was masculine vanity fed on sweeter diet. He was the last lion on view at Adrian's villa, and happily for himself was unaware how many lions had reigned before him. Nor did he know that the tenure of his glory was almost as frail as the hold by which certain despotic Orientals have grasped their greatness, knowing themselves sovereign lords and rulers over the slaves beneath their feet, and only occasionally disturbed by the consideration that they were liable to be quietly assassinated at the first convenient opportunity. Mr. Bell saw himself the center of an enchanted circle. The princess was never weary of repeating his praises. He was her genius, her trouvaille, the painter she had discovered and given to an obtuse but grateful world. This was the gist of her romantic talk, though it was dressed up in pretty words, entwined with so many flowers of feminine fancy, that Laurence may be forgiven if he failed to discover the serpent of parvenu insolence lurking beneath the blossoms. The princess declared that Laurence Bell was the painter of the future, and that she admired him beyond all measure. The adorers of the princess lived only to minister to her caprices, and were quite as ready to accept Laurence Bell as they were to accept her Maltese lapdogs,
or toilettes from the Rue de la Paix. The painter was less obnoxious than the lapdogs, not so much in the way as those robes à queue, which interposed impassable billows of silk and lace between Julia de Aspromonte and her worshippers. So the narrow world of Adrian's villa welcomed the rising star of this new Raphael, and Laurence drank deeply of the intoxicating cup which his patroness offered to his feverish lips. People told him of his future greatness, and he believed in their flattering promises. He believed in them and in himself. Did not this wild throbbing in his breast, this quenchless fire in his veins, presage coming glory? He was no longer of the common herd, patient, industrious, hopeful, content with small successes, a happy gleam of sunshine, a cleverly handled bit of still life, the careful making out of a textile fabric. Ah, no. He sighed for some single and signal triumph. He waited some wild impulse of unfettered genius, which should lift him at one bound to the topmost heights of Olympus, and place his name among the names that are remembered with those of the gods. He had heard of late so much of his future that it is scarcely strange if he had grown a little idle, or perhaps rather fitful as to the manner of his work in the present. When a man has the certainty of being a millionaire sooner or later, he can hardly be expected to take cognizance of small wastes and expenditures pending the falling in of his fortune. The world of Adrian's villa had assured the young man of the wealth of his genius, and he may be forgiven if, feeling himself so rich, he was inclined to squander some small portion of his vast possessions. Without paraphrase, Laurence Bell's old habits of industry had forsaken him. It was very delightful to him to sit before his easel in the splendid music room at the villa, dreaming of that fair future, while his brushes and palette lay idle by his side. What a different life from the dull, plodding days in Charnock Street. There only incessant labor, the slow advance of manipulative skill. Here, surroundings such as foster genius, a perpetual feast of form and color, and inspirations that lifted him above himself. The fact that none of the inspirations had as yet been transferred to canvas was a small thing. They had left their traces in certain pencil notes jotted in the painter's commonplace book. Unhappily, those random notes, traced by the feverish hand of genius, are apt to seem very vague and incomprehensible when genius refers to them after any prolonged interval. The sketches for the frescoes had been discussed and painted, and in many instances painted out again. It must be confessed that even at her best the princess was difficile. She had her own ideas about Amphion, her own archetypal Orpheus, not easily to be translated by mortal brush. "I should like your Amphion better if his flesh were not so pink," she said one day, when the last eccentricity imported from the Rue de la Paix had proved a doubtful success. "I do not know much about persons of that class, but I can hardly believe that the son of Jupiter and Antiope would have so much rose color in his complexion." And hereupon, Mr. Bell slapped his biggest brush across the roseate limbs of the juvenile Amphion, bathed in the sunrise of Mount Cithaeron, and flung himself into his Roman fauteuil, disgusted with the princess, himself, and the universe. Typhus fever is not more infectious than an uncertain temper. Laurence Bell, 6 months ago the most amiable of men, had become a creature of nerves and caprices. Now plunged in the depths of a gloomy sulkiness, now elevated by feverish excitement, ready to abjure the favor of his princess and cut his throat offhand at one moment, in the next prostrate at her feet and beseeching her with passionate tears to trample on the neck of her slave. Did he love Julia de Aspromonte? That is a question which I, his biographer, will not take upon myself to answer. Certain it is that by reason of her influence he had ceased to love anyone else. He rarely thought of Amy Greystone now, and when he did, she seemed to him no more than a part of his vanished youth, something that had once been very precious, something not to be recalled, and no longer necessary to his existence. "She will be happier with a better man," he said to himself. "I was not worthy of so much affection, such divine unselfishness. I am a being of storm and passion. Better that I should be a slave beneath the feet of Julia de Aspromonte, if I derive inspiration from her cruelty." It is not to be supposed that the infallible milliner of the Rue de la Paix often fell short of perfection, or that the princess often complained of the pinkness of Amphion, or otherwise depreciated the work of her protégé. There were times when she was rapturous in her admiration of his sketches, but on these happier days she was suggestive, and her suggestions, being always more or less impracticable, were apt to hinder the progress of the painter's labor, since he would fain have achieved the impossible for her sake. Thus it happened that, when the London season was over, Laurence Bell had nothing to show for his 3 months' work but 2 or 3 experimental sketches of Amphion and Orpheus. The summer had waned, and he had earned nothing. Commissions would have come in upon him thickly after the notice elicited by his Lady Macbeth, had he been free to accept them. But he was not free, and it speedily became notorious that he had sold his liberty, or, in other words, had been taken up by the Princess d'Aspromonte.
"Have you ever seen a baby of 12 months handle a piece of costly china?"
said a gentleman who had known the princess on the continent.
"For a little while, what rapture the small face expresses! What babbling murmurs of unintelligible delight escape the infantine lips! But then, behold, suddenly, without a moment's warning, the darling child grows weary of the fragile toy, and dashes it to the ground to shiver into atoms. That is the way such women as Julia d'Aspromonte treat such men as Laurence Bell."
End of section 6. Read by Nova Silva. Section 7 of Circe by Babington White, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Nova Silva. Scene the 2nd. Fatal Patronage. Nay, your eyes threaten as unto blood. What will you do to make men take your sweet word? Pitiful. You are as pitiful as he that's hired for death, and loves the slaying yet better than the hire. The season waned, and the painter stood in his gorgeous studio, staring blankly at his easel. The sketch he had contemplated had been painted out and painted in 6 times, and, looking at his work today, he was less than ever satisfied. There were 2 more easels standing in the room, and on each there was a sketch. Here, Orpheus and Eurydice. There, the flaying of Marsyas, a hideous study of realism after the old Flemish masters, inspired by the recollection of an unutterably hideous triumph of manipulative skill in the hospital at Bruges. It was upon his Amphion the young painter looked with a desponding gaze. He had dreamed such ambitious dreams. He had made such daring experiments, and his dreams and experiments seemed to have resulted in so little. The figure which he saw on his easel was not the being that had life in his brain. He had imagined a demigod, and had painted only a handsome young man. The young man was very handsome. The picture was well painted. The sky above the head of the young musician was a very fair study of a sky seen from Hampstead Heath. But the sunshine of Olympus was not upon the canvas. "My sketches are failures," the painter said to himself. "I must begin my work all over again. I will not attempt anything commonplace. I will not fall into the trite and feeble. Is it in me to do anything really great? I begin to doubt myself. I used to fancy I needed nothing but opportunity. But now the opportunity has come, and the power seems wanting. Perhaps I am the wrong man for the frescoes after all." He looked almost despairingly at the lofty walls which were to be decorated by his pencil. The amber draperies still shrouded the plaster, and more than once the princess had hinted her weariness of those silken hangings, and her impatience for the commencement of the great work. "At this rate I shall be quite an old woman before you finish my music room, and then no one will care to come to my concerts," she said one day. "What slow work it seems! And I thought genius was always so rapid, a power too subtle to be under the dominion of time. I fancied you would paint my frescoes almost as easily as your Amphion built his walls. But, alas, we have no enchanted lyres nowadays, nor enchanted pencils. I wish I had lived in the age of the gods." To such regrets as these, Laurence Bell had been compelled to listen very frequently. They stung him more keenly than the stab of a sword. There were times when he looked back to the quiet days of his obscurity in Charnock Street, and remembered the peace which had been his in those days. "Would the fame of a Raphael repay me for so much suffering?" he sometimes asked himself. "If I win it. As yet, these intervals of depression were brief and infrequent. The temperament of the artist was scarcely less variable than that of his patroness. If he had his gloomy fits, he also had his intervals of happiness, of elation, as far above the gladness of common mortals as his gloom was deeper than the gloom of the vulgar. In his happier hours, life seemed one long festival. With the princess, happiness meant the gratification of every caprice, the indulgence of every whim. To be with her was to breathe the atmosphere of a world peopled by pariahs and Rothschilds. Her lavish expenditure, her utter disregard of the price she paid for her caprices, had won her a reputation for generosity. But whether she really was generous was a question that could only have been answered by those who knew her well. She would fain have loaded the young painter with pecuniary benefits, but the spirit of the tailor's son could not brook this humiliation. Nor did Laurence want money, for he had not scrupled to avail himself of Mr. Moccatti's permission when he found himself à sec, and had drawn upon that gentleman very freely. Life for the rising painter of North Audley Street was a very costly affair as compared with the life of the Parlieu of Fitzroy Square. Raphael cannot stoop to examine the weekly accounts of his landlady, or to question the books of his laundress, nor can Raphael endure the slow torture of an omnibus ride when an impatient princess awaits his arrival. In these latter days, Mr. Bell spent more upon hansom cabs than the cost of his entire maintenance in Mr. Greystone's modest household. He lived now among men who had never counted the expense of their pleasures, and the influence of his surroundings had already made him extravagant. There were times when he felt so sure of fame and fortune that his imprudences of the present seemed only so many mortgages upon the future. The 3 months which had gone by since the opening of the academy had contained for Laurence Bell more of that element which men are agreed to call pleasure than all his previous existence. He had drained the magical breuvage, which had been of old so unfamiliar to his lips. He had drunk so deeply and so greedily that already the draught was beginning to pall a little upon his fevered palate. There comes a time when a man grows weary of sparkling wines, and is fain to fall back upon calmer vintages. But that time had not yet arrived for Mr. Bell. The season was gone, and as he stood before his easel in the sultry summer noontide, it seemed to him as if that departed season had been one ceaseless round of dinner parties and conversationes, races and operas, dinners at Richmond and at Greenwich, and midnight drives through perpetual moonlight, behind horses that rushed homewards as if they too had been fevered by the wines of Burgundy and Rhineland. She sneers at the slowness of my progress, he said to himself bitterly, but how rarely she allows me to work. This was very true. Having captured a tame young lion, Madame d'Aspromonte's dearest delight was to exhibit the noble creature in all his paces, and to show her admirers how abjectly the king of beasts could grovel beneath her feet. She had the instincts of a feminine Van Amberg, and was pleased to demonstrate her power over the grand creatures that make common mortals fear. And did society permit her to lead her own life and to patronize newly discovered genius without damage to her fair name? Yes, and no. Society had never been pleased to recognize the eccentric Roman lady. She occupied a certain kind of position in the world of fashion, but it was not a dwelling place of brick and stone within the walls of the city. It was rather a tent on the outskirts, which might be struck at any hour. Madame d'Aspromonte was a wandering notoriety, who was accepted by society on the condition that she would always wander. True, that the building of Adrian's villa looked like an intention to settle, but the princess was in all probability amongst those foolish people who built houses for wiser folks to inhabit. It was scarcely to be supposed that a lady who had grown weary of every city in civilized Europe would forever be satisfied by the delights of North End. The door of the orangery was opened softly, while the painter stood before his easel, and the opening of the door was followed by that gentle rustling of silken fabric which announces the advent of an elegant woman. "And our Amphion, mon ami, comment va-t-il?" she asked as she approached her despondent protégé. "What, Mr. Bell? Is the despairing fit upon you today, that you regard your picture du nul regard, after all your bright visions on the terrace at Richmond last night?" "The brighter my dreams, the more bitter the waking," answered Laurence. "I am an impostor, Madame d'Aspromonte. Why do you waste your interest upon me? Let me go back to—" He would have said my old friends, but a choking sensation in his throat stifled the words. "Let me go back to my old life, he added, after a moment's pause. Your old life? Ah, that means Miss Greystone, I suppose, said the princess maliciously. The painter did not notice the home thrust. Let me abandon all thought of the frescoes, princess, he went on, and forget that you have ever known me. I cannot forget that if you disappoint all my hopes of you. Do you know that you will render me ridiculous in the eyes of my friends if you do not achieve great things? Do you know the promises I have made for you? Is your arm to grow feeble all at once because a great opportunity is given you? There was a time when you had the daring of a genius, the industry of an artisan. Now you appear to have neither. You do not give me time to work, the painter murmured fretfully. How do I infringe upon your time? Cried the princess. You have only to lock that door and your apartment is sacred. Can I lock the door when you are on the other side of it? The princess smiled, a slow, dreamy smile, and there was an unwonted softness in her eyes as they contemplated the young painter. There are days on which I doubt myself, days on which I almost despair, exclaimed Laurence passionately. You hope too much of me. You ask too much of me. You pledge me to engagements that are too heavy for me. Your praises are a burden that weigh me down. I was once content with the imperceptible progress of my monotonous days, and when the year was done, I was surprised to find how much I had achieved. Now, all is changed. I seem to do wonders every day, and yet, at the end of months, I have done nothing. Why is this? Because you are impatient. Who makes me impatient? I suppose I am that who, answered the princess with another smile. She was a coquette, jusqu'à la moelle, and this subtle flattery was for her a kind of dram-drinking. Forgive me, pleaded Laurence. I am ready to find fault with all the world when I feel myself so weak and incapable. Do not look at me so despairingly. You will soon be secure from all intrusion. How do you mean, madame? I mean that the season is over, and I must leave town in a day or two. You will leave this place? Naturally. Even bankers' clerks have their holidays at this time of year. You would not wish me to deny myself the privileges of a banker's clerk. Yes, they leave London, murmured Laurence disconsolately. But this is not London. That is to say, it is not Cheapside or the Borough, replied the princess. But in these gardens, under those old trees, one might fancy oneself 100 miles from town. I have not the knack of fancying that sort of thing, answered the princess with a shrug of her imperial shoulders. To my mind, suburban rusticity is the poorest of all imitations, as complete a mockery as the sham diamonds of the Palais Royal. I like to have trees and flowers about me always, but I cannot imagine myself surrounded by woodland and pastures simply because I have trees and flowers. I languish for expensive plains, purple hilltops wreathed in morning mists, far-off glimpses of a sunlit ocean, 1,000 delights that are impossible in the neighborhood of Fulham. And you are going away? Asked the painter with blank despair in his face. Julia d'Aspromonte paused for a few moments before she replied to this anxious question. The despairing gaze of her protégé was very pleasant to her. Such looks of anguish, such heart-burnings and slow tortures, had long been to her as the very wine of life. She lingered a little to taste the aroma of that wine. Yes, Mr. Bell, I am going away, she said at last. I have not quite decided where I shall spend the autumn, but I shall not spend it in England. Your climate is insufferable after July. I shall go to Biarritz. I have been there more than once, but unfortunately I have been everywhere, and must content myself with the place I am least tired of. In the meantime, this room will be consecrated to your use, and on my return I shall hope to find Amphion and his people transferred from your easel to the wall. The painter was silent for a few moments. He stood before the Roman lady, trifling nervously with his sheaf of brushes, and staring absently at the floor. I thought that I should be inspired by your sympathy, that you would be interested in the progress of the fresco, he said thoughtfully, and then exclaimed passionately, How can I work when you are away? You are really more unreasonable than even genius has a right to be, cried the princess. Just now you were complaining that my presence has been a hindrance to you. Sometimes you hinder, at other times you inspire me. Yes, Princess, you were right, I am a creature of contradictions. Sometimes I feel a fire, an energy, which seems strong enough to surmount all the difficulties that lie between me and perfection. And then there comes upon me a languor that is akin to despair. Oh, Madame d'Aspremante, it is in your power to give me new force, new inspiration. And how, pray? Asked the princess. She walked away to one of the long windows as she asked this question. The action, slight as it was, seemed to Laurence painfully indicative of indifference. Have you forgotten the promise you made me when I first came to this house? Madame d'Aspremante reflected a little, with her dark brows fixed in a meditative frown. She was standing in an open window, with the meridian sunlight streaming full upon her. It is not for the masculine pen to interpret the mysteries of a Parisian toilette, but the lady's dress seemed to consist of some silken fabric of pearly gray, with knots of scarlet gleaming here and there athwart the clear obscure of black lace drapery. On her head she wore a cluster of black lace and scarlet poppies, which might or might not have been meant for a bonnet, and with her dark beauty thus set off, she made a picture whereon the painter's gaze might well linger. I have such an unfortunate habit of forgetting my promises, she said presently. What did I promise you, Mr. Bell? That you would sit to me for your portrait. Ah, I remember, answered the princess carelessly. And it was to be a better portrait than that by Ingres. Let me have my frescoes first, if you please. When you have excelled Michelangelo in fresco, you shall surpass Ingres in portraiture. It amuses you to laugh at me, said Laurence peevishly. Ah, madame, you do not understand the nature of an artist. It appears to be something not very easily understood. Let me paint your portrait, pleaded Laurence. Give me time for the frescoes, and keep your promise, the promise you made me that night when I knelt at your feet for the first time. I have been at your feet ever since. What if I indulge your caprice? I shall produce a work of art. I shall realize your hopes of me. I shall win the fame you have prophesied for me. The world shall discover that your judgment has not been false. I tell you, Madame d'Aspremante, that my future is in your hands. It was a shadowy resemblance of your face which first won me distinction. Was there no fatality in that? My fate brought me face to face with the incarnation of my dreams, and from that hour... He paused, with his hands clasped, extended towards his patroness, and a wild light in his eyes. All that was spiritual in his countenance had developed during the last 3 months. All that was earthly had undergone deterioration. His eyes had gained new brightness. His cheeks were tinted with a hectic glow. The perfect outline of his features was sharpened and intensified. The natural fairness of his brow had become the whiteness of marble. But the cheeks were sunken, the lips blanched, the brilliant eyes were surrounded by purple shadows. There was that in his face which would have struck terror to the heart of Amy Greystone, but which, in the eyes of Madame d'Aspremante, was only an interesting delicacy of appearance, highly appropriate to genius. Why do you pause? She asked. Because there are some things that cannot be put into words. I shall offend you, and you shall banish me forever. I am not easily offended, nor is my vengeance altogether implacable. I will not brave your wrath. My fate has made me your slave. It is in your power to give your slave renown. Let me paint your picture. I feel that it is in me to concentrate all my strength upon the solitary chef d'oeuvre. That single triumph shall be the glorification of your beauty. I have dreamt of this picture until I have become the slave of my own fancy. It comes between me and all the work I attempt. Let me lay the ghost of this all-absorbing idea, and then I shall be a free man again, able to work in a groove like the dullest of plotters. It shall be so, said the princess. But when must I give you the sittings? At once. I have the attitude, the details, all thought out. I languish to begin. In that case, I shall not be able to leave town. Delay your departure for a little. It is fame which I ask at your hands. If you abandon me in this hour of despondency and weakness, you will sound the death knell of my hopes. This is the crisis of my fate." "In plain English, you mean that I am to stay in London after everybody has left, and sit for 2 or 3 hours a day on a dais to be stared at. A professional model would do as much for 18 pence an hour. I want something more than a model. I want inspiration." "Well, my promise shall not be broken. We begin our sittings tomorrow." Tears started to the eyes of the painter. Sudden tears which he was powerless to control. He dashed the water drops aside with an angry gesture, cruelly ashamed of his weakness. He had yet to learn the extremity of that weakness, moral and physical. "I thank you with all my soul," he cried. "Do not talk of thanks. What does it matter whether I go to Biarritz or remain in London? It is only a question of finding existence more or less tiresome. And now, I am going to the last flower show of the year. Will you go with me?" Never yet had Laurence Bell been so heroic as to refuse this kind of invitation. He had swelled the train of the princess at fete and flower show, on race ground and in concert room, when he knew that the fleeting hours which he wasted were so many points lost in the great game of life. Night after night he had sworn to himself that his future days should be devoted to steady labor, and the next day had seen his oath broken. He could not resist the silken thread that led him hither and thither at a woman's will. He measured his years against those of Raphael. "I am 22, and I have done nothing. At 25 he had painted the entombing of Christ, and at 30 he made the walls of the Vatican his monument. Only 10 years more, and what shall I do in 10 years, if I work no faster than I am working now?" End of Section 7. Read by Nova Silva.
Section 8 of Circe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Circe by Babington White. Volume 1. Scene the 3rd. Visionary Triumphs. A living image which did far surpass in beauty the bright shape of vital stone, which drew the heart of Pygmalion. I assert myself that I do not behold the outward creation, and that for me it is hindrance and not action. What, it will be questioned, when the sun rises, do you not see a round disk of fire somewhat like a guinea? Oh, no, no, I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." I question not my corporeal eye, any more than I would question a window concerning a sight. I look through it and not with it. The Princess Desparmonte sat for a portrait. She was not what is commonly called a good sitter. She could not remain in a fixed attitude for an hour, simpering at pleasant stories told by her painter, while he put in the lights and shadows about her eyes, or labored at the modelling of her chin. She was fitful in this as in all other actions of her life, and was wont to grow suddenly tired of the whole business, and rise disdainfully from her chair of state, just as the painter was warming to his work. For Laurence Bell, these sittings were a strange admixture of anguish and rapture. It was happiness to feast upon the beauty of his enchantress. It was torture to be subject to her caprices. There had been considerable discussion as to the costume and background, and after much opposition, Madame d'Espramonte had consented to indulge the fancy of the painter. She was to be painted in classic draperies, but in more than ordinary splendor of color. A tiara was to crown the proud brow. A voluminous mantle of Tyrian purple was to flow from the marble shoulders. The background was to be strictly classic, a chamber in Pliny's Laurentium looking westward, the hour sunset. It was to be a picture as well as a portrait, the picture of a Roman empress sitting alone in the sunset, with the pillars of a colonnade and prismatic hues of a sunlit sea in the background. At first this new work progressed with a marvellous rapidity, while Amphion and Orpheus remained in their embryo state, and Eurydice smiled her sad smile upon the spectator from out a haze of unfinished draperies. After the 3rd sitting, the princess insisted on seeing the picture, and was pleased to pronounce herself enraptured. It is an admirable portrait," she exclaimed. "If you take my advice, you will not touch it any more. Leave it as a sketch. There is more in it than in 19 out of 20 finished pictures. Every added touch may weaken the effect. There is genius in it. Pray do not overlay the broad touches of genius by the laborious mechanism of the Academy." Laurence Bell smiled incredulously. "I shall work at this picture for months," he said with quiet decision. "It is to be my magnum opus." "And pray, am I to sit to you for months?" "You must give me a sitting when you please," the young man replied sadly. "And when I cannot get a sitting, I must work from memory. I do not think that will be very difficult." After this, the work progressed very slowly, almost as slowly as the sketches from the frescoes. Yet it was not for lack of industry that the picture advanced so slowly. The painter came every day to Adrian's villa and worked steadily at his canvas, whether the princess sat to him or not. Nor did he occupy himself with any other picture, though he stood in much need of the money that he might have obtained from the sale of pot-boilers. He worked hard, and he worked constantly, but his canvas seemed to advance no more than Penelope's net. So much was he given to blotting out the progress of yesterday under the influence of the fancies of today. After the third sitting, he had resolutely refused Madame d'Espremonte so much as a glimpse of his work. "A picture is a thing of shreds and patches until the hour in which it is finished," he said, and the princess submitted with a shrug of her shoulders. In sober truth, she submitted with so good a grace that a keener observer than Laurence Bell might have perceived that the subject had become somewhat indifferent to her. The painter had now to rely much upon memory, for the lady very seldom honoured him with a sitting. She remained in town, however, and for that one fact he was unutterably grateful. He had feared her departure with an unreasonable terror. Whatever the nature of the spell which she had woven around him, it held him her bond slave. He had never asked himself whether the passion which possessed him was love or madness, but he knew that it was a thraldom from which there was no escape but death. What had he in the world but this woman's sympathy? The friend of his boyhood, the girl who was to have been his wife, were forever lost to him. Nor had he lost these only. The freshness of his heart, the elasticity of his spirit were gone beyond recall. He had nothing then but his dream of fame and the sympathy of Giulia d'Espremonte. Had the Roman lady any warmer feeling than artistic interest in an artist's work? There had been an occasional tenderness in her eyes, a softness in her tones, which had inspired the painter with a daring dream of happiness. Some of his new friends had told him that the princess was éprise, and that it rested with him to secure the defunct Espremonte's millions. But this idea the young man rejected with passionate scorn. "Do you think I would ask Giulia d'Espremonte to accept my name unless it were worthy to be worn by her?" he cried impetuously. "I shall be rich before I tell her that I love her. Wealth comes with renown nowadays, and if I ever win a great name, I shall then be above suspicion." "If you take my advice, you will not wait for the great name," replied the worldling. "A woman's caprices are as transient as the foam on a tumbler of Cliquot." "I like my Cliquot still and dry," said Laurence haughtily. "I shall never trade upon a woman's caprices. I can afford to wait until I am loved." The worldling shrugged his shoulders and grinned as Laurence turned away from him. "Madder than hares in March," he muttered to himself. "If he waits for Giulia d'Espremonte's love, he may wait as long as the wandering Jew. The poor creature seems in earnest, and she will bray him in her mortar, as she has brayed the rest of us. She is an elegant ogress, who grinds men's bones to make her bread. And in this case, there seems to be genuine heart's blood, as well as bone. That is damage, as Mocatti would say." There were those who knew the princess, and would have warned Laurence Bell of his danger, but he would accept no warning. He was ready to hurl his cartel of defiance at her accusers, ready to give the lie to every hint of her falsehood. Or even if she had been false, if she had lured other men to their ruin, unconsciously beguiling them to the shipwreck of their hopes by the fatal light of her eyes, was that any reason she should deceive him? With him she had always been earnest, Capricious it might be, but the very spirit of truth and candor. This is what he told himself on those rare occasions when he ventured to contemplate his position. Yes, she loved him. Could he doubt it? Had he not surprised looks instinct with love, accents tremulous with suppressed vibration of passion? He was beloved, and it rested with him to become worthy to kneel at the feet of his enchantress and cry, "Art and fame are equal to wealth and rank. Both are mine, and I can boldly ask you to share a name that will be remembered when the princess of Aspromonte are forgotten." It rested with himself. The fever which consumed his very life was the fever of impatience. For Amy Greystone, he would have been content to win his laurels leaf by leaf, but he must needs have a crown of laurel to cast beneath the feet of his princess, and it was to win the crown that he languished. "Festina lont," said the Emperor Augustus, and Laurence Bell had bitter reason to feel the wisdom of the axiom. Haste with him had not been progress, and now, as he counted the months before the opening of the next exhibition, he wondered whether his work would be fairly done. "I want months for the draperies, the details, the background," he said to Giulia d'Espremonte. "I want my picture to be a feast of color. I'm trying to blend the daring of Rubens, the grandeur of Van Dyck, and the laborious manipulations of the pre-Raphaelites." "Perhaps you're aiming at too much," replied the princess, who happened to be in one of her provoking moods at this moment. "What is that verse of your Shakespeare, jumping ambition which leaps over itself, is it not? 'If I o'erleap myself, I will bury my disgrace in the grave,'" answered Laurence. "I shall never touch a brush again, if this picture is a failure." "Seneca denies eris," exclaimed the princess. "There is something here which tells me that I should not survive failure," answered the painter, striking his breast with a passionate gesture. Could there be failure in store for him? Oh, surely not. As his work progressed beneath his hand, his confidence seemed to grow with it. He felt that he had done wisely in abandoning the frescoes. This picture would make him a name that would ensure the success of his future efforts. Of his present work, he knew no weariness. The subject had been indeed inspiration for him. His life seemed divided between the outer world and the world of his studio, and he scarcely knew which of his two divinities appeared most beautiful to him. The princess who smiled or frowned upon him in the flesh, or that other Giulia d'Espremonte whose radiant face beamed from his canvas. Since that occasion on which the princess had insisted on seeing the portrait in its earliest stage, no eye save his own had looked upon the painter's work. He had taken the most jealous care to prevent any revelation of the secrets of his art, and had even invented a special easel with solid mahogany doors secured by a Brahma lock. Those doors were impenetrable as the gates of paradise to the unworthy. On this point he had been inflexible, deaf, even to the pleading of his enchantress, and as time went by, his enchantress became very well reconciled to his refusal. She made Adrian's villa her headquarters, but it was not to be supposed that she could survive an entire autumn and early winter without change of air and scene. She went hither and thither, attended only by her incomparable Parisian maid and an elderly German lady, who was at once her confidant, factotum, and amant d'année, sometimes to ride, sometimes to Brighton, sometimes to Paris. Laurence counted the hours of her absence and welcomed her return with a feverish rapture. He passed his nights only in the Nid de Rondin, which cost him so dearly. His real home was in his atelier at the villa. He came early in the morning. He rarely left till midnight. On some days he dined with his patroness, on other days he did not dine at all. The question of dining or not dining was one of the smallest possible importance in his mind. But the hours he spent with Giulia d'Espremonte were very precious to him. "Does she love me?" he asked himself after every evening passed in her society. "Does she love me, or is it all a wild dream, a mad delusion, which must end in despair? I dare not look forward to the end." Thus the autumn months passed by. Christmas came and passed. The princess spent her Christmas at Brighton. Laurence stood in the great unpeopled music-room, painting, while the Christmas bells rang out upon the frosty air. Could he do less than remember his last Christmas, and the humble festivities of Charnock City? At this hour, Amy Greystone's little hand had rested on his arm, as they walked to church together in the wintry sunlight. Now he seemed to have done with church, as he had done with friends and home, with everything except wild dreams and wilder passion. Ah, how innocently happy they had been, he and his betrothed, how full of plans for the future, how confident, how hopeful. Did she too remember that vanished happiness? Did she too regret all that had been lost within the year that was coming to an end? Her regrets at least must be less poignant than his, since he had no cause for remorse. The new year found Adrian's villa still deserted by its mistress, and Laurence Bell still working with unabated energy. Madame d'Espremonte returned towards the middle of January, and the old circle of artists and celebrities began to reassemble in her classic salons. Once more Laurence beheld his patroness, the cynosure of a brilliant crowd, and as he watched her from afar off, surrounded by friends and flatterers, it seemed to him as if she was no nearer to him than on the day when he had first seen her in Trafalgar Square. One bleak morning in February, the princess came into the painting room, gorgeous in violet velvet and sables, and accompanied by a gentleman who was a stranger to Mr. Bell. He was tall and dark and foreign-looking, with large piercing black eyes and a fierce moustache and a certain wildness of aspect, and Madame d'Espremonte introduced him to the painter as Herr Frolic. Les beaux esprits doivent s'entendre, she observed graciously. To me it seems that art is the poetry of the universe, which every great artist transcribes after his own fashion. Mr. Bell translates his inspirations by the aid of form and colour. Herr Frolic's fancies clothe themselves in harmony. In effect, Mr. Bell, I expect you to be delighted to know this gentleman, who is an old friend of mine and a compatriot of yours. The painter's looks did not portray the delight expected of him. He stared at the stranger with an angry light in his eyes. He held his own ground by such a feeble tenure that the idea of a rival filled him with alarm. And might not this man be a rival? "And this is your music room?" said Herr Frolic. "Charming, perfect, worthy of the mind which designed it. You will order your new Erard to be placed yonder, facing those windows? The room is charming. I only regret your hangings. Those superb amber draperies will suffocate your sopranos." "Unfortunately, my only decorations are those amber hangings," replied the princess with a cruel glance at her protégé. "I thought the room was to be painted in fresco," said the German professor. "It will be painted in fresco when I can find a painter. Unhappily, the age of the Titans has gone by. The Rubens who will line the walls of a Louvre with the work of his pencil in a summer's holiday is not to be found nowadays." "Rubens was a manufacturer," exclaimed Herr Frolic disdainfully, "and ought to have called himself P.P. Rubens and Company Unlimited. I think more of a single chef d'oeuvre than of square miles of slapdash color and daring drawing. May I hope to be honored with a glance at Mr. Bell's picture?" he asked courteously. "I shall be very proud to show it to you on the first Monday in May," replied Laurence with a sickly smile. "Which means that I am to wait till all the world may see it for a shilling, and until then, c'est le feu et défendu, I suppose," exclaimed the composer gaily. "Well, I have neither the curiosity of Eve nor the disobedience of Adam. I will teach myself to be patient." "And now for your programme," said the princess. "I am dying to hear what you propose." Herr Frolic seated himself before a bonheur du jour in sandalwood and ormolu by Reisner and began to write. Laurence Bell looked aghast from the princess to the professor, and then back to the princess. "You're going to give a concert?" he asked. "Why should I not? The season is beginning, and the people are teasing me for a peep at my music room." "I thought you would wait until the frescoes were painted before you gave your inaugural concert," faltered Laurence with undisguised mortification. "I am not accustomed to wait," replied Madame d'Espremonte, with a grandeur worthy of the grand monarque. "And I certainly do not care to wait a quarter of a century. Do not fear that we are going to disturb you, Mr. Bell. Your easel shall be sacred. We may want the room 2 or 3 mornings for rehearsals. Voilà tout. Now for your list, Herr Frolic. Here it is. First a quartet of Beethoven's, then a morceau of Verdi by your favorite soprano, Miss Hamilton, who has the voice of an angel and handles it like an idiot. Then a poor little trifle of my own, Star-like Eyes, a reverie respectfully dedicated to the Princess d'Espremonte. Next, a duet of Rossini's between your 2 military buffos, who hate each other so ferociously that they will not even consent to sing in the same key. And next, the professor finished the perusal of his program, to which the princess listened with profound attention, interrupting him more than once, however, with an objection or suggestion. Laurence Bell locked the doors of his easel and looked on with a sharp anguish gnawing at his heartstrings. He was always on the watch for a rival, and surely this wild-eyed German, with his sister art, was the most dangerous rival who had yet come between him and the woman who had made him her slave. "You promised to give me a sitting today, Madame d'Espremonte," he said presently with unutterable reproachfulness in his tone. "Did I really?" exclaimed the princess. "Then I fear, for once, I must break my promise. I'm going to make a round of calls. Herr Frolic and I have to hunt up our amateur performers, and amateurs will toujours se faire piller. It is the most tiresome work in the world. Do not look at me so reproachfully, Mr. Bell. I have given you too much of my time already. I never knew any good come of a picture for which there were so many sittings. How many could Guido have had for his Beatrice Cenci? 1/2 hour at midnight after the trial, or in the dim sickly dawn before the hour of execution." In another moment she had vanished, attended by the strange professor. Laurence stood looking blankly at the door by which she had departed. A concert! She is going to give concerts. She is tired of waiting for the frescoes. She is tired of my art. Oh God, is the dream coming to an end? He cried aloud in the sharp accents of despair. Then suddenly his face changed and brightened with an almost ecstatic expression. He returned to his easel, unlocked the doors, and threw them open. For some minutes he stood transfixed before his work, gazing at the canvas in a kind of rapture. "No," he cried, "the dream shall become a reality. This picture will make me famous. It will link her name eternally with mine. She has rank, wealth, beauty. It is renown alone she sighs for, and I can give her that." He dashed at the canvas like an inspired demon and painted furiously for hours. Through all that day he saw no more of the princess or her friend the professor. But at 8 in the evening a servant came to him with a courteous message from the lady, to the effect that she was waiting dinner. He went at once to the dining room, dressed in his painting costume of black velvet, which was the perfection of artistic coxcombry. What did it matter how much his tailor charged him, so long as he could appear pleasing in the sight of his siren? Amy Greystone had been well pleased with him in the threadbare paint-besmeared jacket, which he had worn until it was ragged at the elbows and white at the seams. But Giulia d'Espremonte required that all her surroundings should be beautiful. That dinner at Adrian's villa was one of the most miserable meals which Laurence Bell ever ate, if it can be said that he ate anything. To his fever-parched lips the carefully studied compositions of the purest culinary art were as dust and ashes. To his tired eyes it seemed as if the clusters of waxen tapers in the bronze candelabra were the myriad torches of pandemonium. To his nostrils the perfume of the hothouse flowers seemed the noxious vapours of the bottomless pit. Herr Frolic and the painter dined alone with the princess, whose Amudani was the victim of chronic migraine, which kept her conveniently out of the way when she was not wanted. Never had the splendid Giulia been more fascinating than on this particular evening. Her round of calls had been successful, her amateurs were eager to assist at the concert, and she was in the highest spirits about the whole affair. Nor was the Viennese professor behind his hostess in gaiety and animation. He was full to the brim of all the freshest scandals in the Parisian world. The wicked things that had been done, and the good things that had been said, the fortunes that gilded youth had devoured in a season, the millions produced by the sale of Mademoiselle Jenny Cadin's ameublement in Russian malachite and ormolu, the horrible suicide of a wealthy German banker who had been heartlessly jilted by Mademoiselle Josepha. To Laurence Bell this talk was like a strange language. Youth and egotism are so apt to go hand in hand. The mind becomes cosmopolitan as it ripens and expands. It was in a very narrow groove that the painter's thoughts travelled, and all this conversation about frivolous scandals and all this repetition of idle bon mots inspired him with unutterable disgust. Nor was he much better pleased when he took a higher flight, and the princess and the professor discoursed eloquently of music. Laurence gnawed his nether lip savagely as he sat apart, listening to arguments in which he was powerless to join, forgotten, neglected, as it seemed to his outraged vanity. It was no longer of Raphael and Michelangelo that Madame d'Espremonte was pleased to converse. She spoke now of Beethoven, Mozart, Palestrina, Gluck, and spoke, as she spoke of everything, with the tone of a connoisseur, for this evening it was her fancy to adore music. After dinner she sat for nearly an hour, lost in a reverie that was almost a trance, while her frolic played dreamy sonatas for her edification. The sound of that pensive music carried Laurence Bell back to the shabbily furnished parlour in Charnock Street, and there arose before him, clear as in a supernal vision, the image of a pale sad face, made glorious by an aureole of golden hair, the face of her who was to have been his companion and consoler, the face of the betrothed whom he had deserted. For what reward? He looked across the room to the spot where the Roman lady was seated by the end of the grand piano, one round white arm lying listlessly upon the instrument, her eyes fixed in an absent, unseeing gaze, grand and beautiful in all the splendour of physical and mental supremacy, but oh, how worn and haggard and world-weary of aspect when compared with that pure image of youth and innocence which the sound of the music had evoked for Laurence Bell. "The end of my dream is coming," he said to himself. "I am near the hour of my awakening." He went back to North Audley Street on foot, through the bleak February night, though the Austrian professor would fain have carried him to town in the snuggest and neatest of broughams. The painter would not accept so much hospitality as a seat in a carriage from his hated rival. He walked home and experienced a kind of fierce pleasure in fronting the bitter blasts of February. All that night he tossed his weary head to and fro upon his pillow in a fever of restlessness and unquenchable excitement, at one moment abandoning himself to despair, in the next suddenly elevated by hope. "I will not be cast off by Giulia d'Espremonte," he said to himself. "My picture must succeed, and success will bring her to my feet. It is only failure which a proud nature cannot tolerate." The next day and the next he worked on, always with the same fiery impetuosity, the same confidence that he was achieving wonders. On the third day he was disturbed by upholsterers and decorators who came to prepare the apartment for Madame d'Espremonte's concert. After this there was no more tranquillity for the painter until the concert was over. It was a success, like everything else undertaken by the princess, for with the unlimited resources a beautiful and accomplished woman can do a great deal. After the concert there was a ball, during which Laurence Bell stood apart watching the dancers. He had never belonged to that idle half of the world which excels in dancing, and of late he had become quite unequal to the exertion of a waltz or polka. He stood apart and felt himself out of place in that brilliant assemblage, a cipher, and a cipher too much. "It is time that it should come to an end," he said to himself. With unspeakable bitterness in his heart, he still worked on at his picture. Let the princess be never so capricious, that still remained, his pride and his glory, the incarnation of all his hopes and dreams. Sometimes he sat before his easel lost in a waking trance, and in the trance he beheld always the same vision. It was the opening day of the Royal Academy, and again the familiar rooms were crowded with eager spectators. In one room the crowd gathered thickest, congregated about one particular picture, a queenly Cleopatra-like woman, arrayed in gorgeous draperies, and with a lurid sunset behind her. On her wrist there perched a splendid tropical bird, and the eyes of the woman were fixed on the eyes of the tamed bird, and a magical fascination, Lamia-like, unholy but inexpressibly beautiful. From one marble shoulder the purple draperies had slipped away, borne down by the weight of their golden embroidery, and in the contrast between the pearly tints of the flesh and the Tyrian dyes of the fabric, the painter had contrived one of the happiest effects of his art. This was the picture which his prophetic vision revealed to him. This was the picture that was yet in progress on his easel, the picture which haunted him day and night, sleeping or waking, relentless as the demon to whom some sinner has bartered away his soul. Laurence had written to Mr. Mocatti apologizing for his somewhat extravagant calls upon his patron's purse, and promising grand results from the great picture. The dealer had spent his winter in Rome, that hotbed of art where he had a small colony of young painters sprouting up for him like early cucumbers in a forcing pit. The great Moccatti's reply to his protégé's letter was somewhat practical in tone. "I fear you have acquired extravagant habits under the influence of your princess," he said. "Remember, she is wasteful as the sieves of the Danaides, and will spill you a small fortune as if it were a glass of water. Beware of her. I am pleased to hear of your great picture, pleased to find that it is to be startling. Au-dessous du vulgaire, soaring above your slow-coach English prejudices. Qui va du chic? But your fresco, comment va-t-il? You say to me no more upon that subject, and it is for your frescoes my princess will have to open her purse. Nor do you tell me of your pot-boilers, your little bits of genre painting, by which you beguile your leisure. You know how I have languished for you to do something great, inspired, but the pot must be kept boiling nevertheless, and these little bits would sell for good prices now that your name has been talked about. This letter was somewhat more practical in tone than was quite consistent with the enthusiasm of the impetuous Mocatti. But when the pupil had remained too long in the land of dreams, it was time the master should descend to the regions of reality. In his letter, the Neapolitan enclosed a memorandum of the sums which his protégé had borrowed from him, as a polite reminder that he desired repayment. The letter in the enclosure had a freezing effect upon the painter, but he speedily shook off the chilling influence. Every day he soared higher and higher in that region of dreams, wherein the dreamer can isolate himself from the cares of this life. He was sitting before his easel about a fortnight after the receipt of this letter, his chamber luminous with that vision of triumph which had beguiled him so often of late, when the door of the painting room was suddenly burst open, and a familiar figure appeared upon the threshold. The portly figure of Antonio Mocatti, superb in a fur-lined overcoat with a red camellia in the buttonhole. Only by the odour of musk and patchouli which he brought with him, Mr. Bell might have recognized his first patron. The painter sprang to his feet and dashed together the doors of his easel, throwing himself before them with an impetuous movement, as if he would have interposed his life between the hidden picture and the profane eyes that would have looked upon it. Eh bien, mon ami, you see, I have come in search of you. It is time to have our pictures ready for sending in. We have sent nothing to the British Institute, nor to a winter exhibition of any sort. Fi donc, jeune parceau, rivor. It is time I returned to put the spur into thy side. The painter was still standing against the locked doors of his easel. The surprise, the excitement had agitated him violently, and he shivered as if from cold. Antonio Mocatti looked at him with sudden intensity of expression. "What are you hiding there? What is this folly of locked doors?" he asked sharply. "My picture, her portrait, such a portrait as no hand has painted since the age of Titian. No, Mocatti, even you shall not see it. No one shall look at my work till it is perfect." "I do not ask to see your picture," cried the dealer, half disdainfully, half regretfully. "I want to look at you." He took the young man by the shoulders and turned his face to the light with a gentle violence. Holding him thus, he stood for some moments, gazing intently at the fever-flushed face. "Great God of heaven," he cried, "it was I who brought you here. I am as bad as a murderer." End of section 8. Section 9 of Circe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Circe by Babington White. Volume 1. Scene the 4th. Mocatti Dissatisfied. Il est parti avec éclat. Tous les yeux étaient éblouis, tous les corps battus. Le cheval de Mazeppa soulevait en passant le sable plein d'étincelles. On répétait « Ohé, ohé !» Mais, en détour de chemin, la monture s'est mise en tronc, et l'Hetman superbe n'est pas encore arrivé. Il n'arrivera pas. "My Laurence, what have they done to thee?" said the dealer very earnestly, after he had stood for some moments with his brows bent and his eyes fixed in a close scrutiny of the young man's haggard face. "Tu es pâle comme un mort. Thou hast been working too hard. Fie then, je ne suis pas si dur. I do not ask thy flesh or thy bones, and if thou hast drawn upon me a little too deeply, I can wait for thy new successes to repay myself. Mais, mon ami, tu me fais peur avec ton effaré. Thou hast been painting too much. It is the old story of the sword and the scabbard. Come then, let me see the triumphs of the sword. Et puis nous aurons soin du fourreau. I languish to behold thy work, thy frescoes, for instance." The impetuous Mocatti made a sudden dash at the amber hangings. He plucked the drapery from the wall and beheld the bare plaster. He had not expected miracles in the way of finished work, but he had expected to see in Madame d'Espramonte's walls more or less disfigured or adorned by the daring experiments of youthful genius. "You have remembered La Fontaine," he said with some touch of bitterness, "and have learnt how to avoid the errors of the hare. Let me see how you have profited by the example of the tortoise." Laurence responded with a sigh that was very like a groan. "There are my sketches," he said, pointing half contemptuously to some canvases huddled ignominiously in the corner of the room. "The princess had been giving concerts. My art must give place to the superior claims of music and her frolic. If the sketches please you no better than they please me, they will scarcely repay you for the trouble of looking at them. I have been working very hard, and have done very little, except this," added the painter, laying his hand upon the closed doors of his easel, with a sudden smile that brightened his pallid face. "And what is this?" asked Mr. Mocatti rather sharply. "A portrait of the princess in a classical dress. I find the dress of the present season very classical. Tout ce qui a du plot grec, avec un soupçon de la Vénus Paphienne," interrupted Mocatti. "A portrait of the princess? That is good," he continued with returning cheerfulness. "You will find portraits pay, if you can sustain a certain position. Have you been painting many other portraits?" Mr. Bell stared aghast at his patron. "Did I not tell you that this was to be my great picture, the picture by which I am to stand or fall?" he asked. "Yes," replied Mr. Mocatti, pulling his moustache with fingers whereon big jewels sparkled in the pale spring sunlight. "But you told me nothing else. I want to see all you have done. First, the sketches. Ah, yes, Orpheus and Eurydice. They are near the portals of hell. Phlegethon lies behind them. They have given the slip to Cerberus. The world of mortals is close at hand. But see, the tender husband must needs look at his adored one. He forgets the solemn mandate. He gazes, and all is lost. Eurydice, rendu, s'échappe comme une ombre. Un regard l'a perdu. Il la rappelle un vaincu geste de la voix. Elle meurt sans se plaindre une seconde fois. Et quelle plainte encore aurait-elle formée? Est-ce un crime pour lui de l'avoir trop aimée? Your Madame Orpheus is all bone and muscle. I don't think any sensible man would want to look at so angular a Eurydice. Your sketches are not chef d'oeuvre. Amphion appears to be a very amiable young man, but as he is in the act of falling on his face, I can only tremble for the bridge of his nose. Va donc, jeune ami, do not look at me with such piteous glances. Thou hast made good progress all this time, and thou hast done some great things, no doubt. But it is not here that we must look for the signs of thy growth of power. What next hast thou to show me? Nothing. Nothing? Cried the dealer, amazed. Then I suppose you have sold all your paintings, he added, changing from the second person singular to the second person plural with an alarming suddenness. You have sold your pictures and have spent the money in fraud of our agreement, was the accusation that shaped itself in his mind. No, Mr. Mocatti, replied Laurence in a freezing tone. I am a painter, and not a seller of pictures. What? Cried the Neapolitan, abandoning all ceremony. Do you mean to tell me that the labor of something like a year is represented by those 3 flimsy sketches, all of which are infinitely below the poorest of your experimental bits in Charnock Street? What? All the summer, all the winter is gone by, and you have painted no pot-boilers, no grisettes, looking out of quaint old garret windows, no lovers drifting down your Cockney Thames, no pretty English demoiselles in moonlit balconies, like the Juliet of your eternal Williams, no partings at railway stations, nothing? Nothing, answered the painter boldly, except that. He struck his hand against the screen that guarded his hidden picture, and met the gaze of his patron with defiance. I will stand or fall by this, he said. Very good, replied the dealer. But if you are going to fall, I hope you will first repay me the money you have been good enough to borrow from me with such aristocratic carelessness. For the son of a German tailor, you have carried matters with a high hand. You must have led the train of a prince at my expense. And now, since my only chance of repayment lies in that picture, I may certainly ask to see it. No, Mocatti, answered the painter firmly. I will exhibit that picture to no mortal eyes until the day before I send it in to the Royal Academy. Indeed, cried the irate Mocatti. And in the meantime I am to whistle for my money, as your English idiom has it? Your money shall be repaid you, with whatever interest will recompense you liberally for the use of it, replied Laurence proudly. My talents have been indeed overrated, if they will not bring me a few hundreds. They will bring you the fortune of a prince, if you will only work, cried Mocatti, clasping his hands passionately. My Laurence, my embryo Raphael, my prince of protégés, my hope, my pride, my glory. Forgive me if I heated myself a little just now, and said hard things to you. I have hoped so much from you. I have 2 or 3 dozen of young painters at Rome. They would line the walls of the Colosseum with pictures and roof it in with frescoes in a month, if I gave them the order. They splash, they dash, they spatter, and cover me canvas so fast that I can only reckon their work by the square yard. But what of that? In all their stupid young heads, there is not so much genius as in your little finger. Think then, my Laurence, what a disappointment to me. You have counted upon so much when I return and find nothing. I tell you that the fruit of my labor is here, said Laurence in a hoarse, faint voice, again striking the doors of his easel with a quick, passionate gesture. It is here, on this one canvas. I have expended the labor of months. I have worked as I never worked before, with untiring industry, with rapture, with passion. Would you have me work otherwise? You complained that I was cold, feeble, matter-of-fact. I lacked the true fire of genius. I was a creature with the common affections and simple aspirations of ordinary humanity. This was not genius. You told me so, Mocatti, and I have learned to recognize the wisdom of your words. The fire, the fever, the passion, the rapture, the torments that were wanting in those days have all come to me. Yes, they have come, repeated the young man with a strange smile creeping over his fever-flushed face. They have taken possession of me, like the demons in the gospel record, and they have set their mark here, on this canvas, which shall make my name immortal. You have had from me the work of a drudge and a hireling, and have profited by it. Here you will have force and concentration, fire and daring, the first fruits of an awakened soul. Mr. Mocatti brightened a little, and stood for some moments looking thoughtfully at his protégé, and tugging the ends of his moustache with a meditative air. One great picture would make amends for all, he said presently, but it would have been as well to paint the little bits of genre for the mercantile market between whiles, quand même. But we must be content with the chef d'oeuvre. Come, mon ami, you will let me have a peep? No, Mocatti, on that point I am firm as a rock. Mais c'est un enfantillage. It is no childishness, no foolish vanity. I stake my future fame upon that picture, and I will cast the die with my own hand. I have had enough of criticism and suggestion. I am too completely the slave of every emotion. My own judgment falters beneath the sway of passion. If I consented to show you that picture in its unfinished state, what then? You would object to this or to that detail, to my treatment of color here, to my manipulation of lights there. You would weaken my confidence, dash my hopes, disgust and dishearten me at the very time when I need all my strength, all my courage. Enfantillage? Yes, cried the painter with a hysterical laugh. What is it but enfantillage? Oh, Mocatti, you do not know what a child I have become. There was something almost piteous in the tone and the look which gave force to these words. But Laurence, my angel, va donc. Du courage, ami. Why is this? What is the meaning of this change? You complained of my sluggish calmness. You complained of my lack of force and passion. I have them now. force which resembles the force of a wave that dashes itself impotently in the teeth of adamantine rocks, passion which withers and consumes. But the passion that creates? Passion destroys more than it creates. My friends have done their best to ruin me, Mocatti, in the purest good nature. They have fed me with lying flatteries until my ambition has outgrown my skill. I dream of painting like Raphael, and awake to hate myself because I paint no better than Laurence Bell. He was pacing to and fro as he spoke, like a young lion impatient of his narrow bounds. The restlessness and fever that possessed him gave colour to his cheeks and brightness to his eyes, so that Mr. Mocatti, who had never ceased to watch him with a somewhat anxious countenance, began to think that the change in his appearance was not so alarming as it had seemed at the first glance to the returning traveller. "But your portrait yonder, that is to be something great, is it not?" asked the dealer. "How do I know?" returned Laurence impatiently. "To me it is something more than a picture. To me it is Guelia d'Espramonte, lovelier than she is in the flesh, a spirit, a goddess. She smiles upon me, she talks to me. Yes, Mocatti, that picture must make me famous. All other pictures that I have ever seen are cold and lifeless when compared to that. It is a woman, not a flat image glued against a flatter landscape, not a hybrid creature, a miserable amalgam of reality and sham, life and death, but a woman, a living, breathing, conscious being, with the free atmosphere around and about her, the breath of heaven stirring amidst her hair. Do you know that in the twilight, when all other pictures vanish into the shadows of coming night, that picture shines out of the darkness, irradiate with phosphorescent splendor? I have studied the secrets of light and shade as no one has studied them since the days of Correggio. You smile at my arrogance, but I am no vain boaster. This time I am certain of success. Yes, the dream of my ambition will be fulfilled. I shall have painted one great picture. Thou shalt paint as many great pictures as Raphael or Leonardo, replied Mr. Mocatti in his most encouraging tone. Thou art as impatient as a child. Denis Calvart told young Rennie that he would make him a great painter in less than 10 years. But our young painters nowadays expect to win the fame of a Guido in as many months. And now let us talk of our princess. I have not yet seen her. She is always beautiful, of course, and she is still kind, still interested in your progress? Yes, said Laurence with a sigh. I believe she is still interested. But she finds that you are rather slow, eh? Asked the dealer with a curious look. She is a creature of impulse, a Vesuvius en jupe. I do not wonder that she has found you slow. I should strongly recommend you to make a beginning with the frescoes before your princess loses patience altogether and sends for another painter. I am ready to resign the commission. You are ready to cut your throat, or to do anything else that is preposterous. Good fortune does not come across a young man's pathway so often that she must needs be flouted. The goddess is no femme payée that will come to you at the lifting of your finger. You will begin your fresco tomorrow, before Madame d'Espramonte's patience is quite exhausted. And my picture will do all the better for being laid aside a little. When you go back to it, your eye will be keener to perceive its faults, its weak points. Laurence shook his head resolutely. No, he said, I have concentrated all my energies upon that one work, and I will touch nothing else until that canvas has been sent in. The dealer shrugged his shoulders with an air of resignation. Eh bien, mon ami, I have 24 young men in Rome, every one of whom would give his ears to stand in your shoes. I will telegraph for a few of them tomorrow. I may induce the princess to entrust one of them with the decoration of her walls. You have been spoiled, Mr. Bell, and you have grown lazy. Remember what Poussin said to a young painter. Il ne vous manque pour devenir un bon peintre qu'un peu de pauvreté. It has been very well to take matters easily while you have had my purse to dip into. But I am not the Pope, any more than you are Raphael. Laurence Bell flushed scarlet. This was indeed shame. To be reproached by this trader and huckster for the loan of a few pounds. The day will come when you will be sorry for this, he said huskily. That day cannot come too soon, replied Mr. Mocatti with delightful sang-froid. You shall have your money to the uttermost farthing. I will show you that I have lost neither force nor facility. The frescoes shall be begun at once. I will be no longer the slave of a woman's caprices, discouraged by the contemptuous shrug of a woman's shoulders, disheartened by the faintest elevation of a woman's dark brows. I will shake myself free from these ignoble fetters. I will— What? Cried the dealer suddenly. The influence of Madame has done mischief. Look at me, Laurence Bell, les yeux dans les yeux. You have sacrificed your art to this woman's folly, instead of deriving inspiration from her sympathy. And I thought that your genius only needed the awakening touch of a magician's wand to expand into greatness. Give me your hand, ami. Yes, it burns like a red-hot coal. You are in a fever. Viens, mon enfant. You shall come into the country with me for an afternoon's holiday. You want rest, air. The atmosphere of this room is killing you. You are very good, Laurence answered coldly. But I cannot leave my work. I am well enough, quite well, and feel my hands stronger than ever. You have inspired me, you see, Mocatti, he added with a bitter laugh. I am impatient to begin my principal fresco. I am impatient to earn the money I have borrowed from you. Do not talk to me of the money. You are ill, Laurence, very ill. You must work no more today, nor yet tomorrow, nor for many tomorrows. The scabbard is worn very thin, ami, and the sword has done so little. I cannot think of rest until I know the fate of that picture. Peste soit de ce tableau, cried Mocatti with impatience. It is a lifetime, and not a picture I am thinking of. Where would have been the glories of the signature chamber if Raphael had worked himself to death in painting his first altarpiece? Mr. Mocatti exhausted his powers of eloquence without success. A spirit of stubborn obstinacy had taken the place of that plastic nature which he had been wont to govern so easily. Laurence Bell refused to sacrifice a few hours of the spring daylight, either to refresh himself or to oblige his patron. He set to work upon a new canvas before the dealer left him, and began the sketch for a new Orpheus and Eurydice. You are right, Mocatti, he cried. My Eurydice was fed comme une poupée this year. I cannot paint that fair-haired, insipid type of womankind. Eurydice the second shall be dark and splendid, a Cleopatra, a Giulia d'Espremonte. Yes, I will make this room the monument of Madame d'Espremonte's beauty. While these walls remain, they shall endure as the record of her loveliness. Nothing could be more charming, replied Mr. Mocatti. Madame d'Espremonte on Imperatrice, Madame d'Espremonte on Eurydice, Madame d'Espremonte par-ci, par-là, pourvu qu'elle paye les frais. But there must come an end even to that, and it seems to me that you can paint nothing except portraits of Madame d'Espremonte. The painter did not deign to reply. The head of his Eurydice already appeared upon his canvas, lightly sketched by a few touches of the crayon in his facile hand. The dealer watched him for some minutes as he stood before the easel, and then silently departed. I shall look to her for an explanation, he said to himself as he passed through the orangery. Bah! He muttered, stopping on the threshold to brush a shower of waxen petals from his coat. This place is suffocating with its perfumes and exotics. My poor Laurence is being stifled with the scent of these poisonous flowers. The atmosphere of his painting room is dangerous. I will hire an airy first floor at Kensington and carry him away from this house tomorrow. Viermis. Il s'agit de meurtre. End of section 9.
Section 10 of Circe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Circe by Babington White, Volume 1, Scene the 5th. Chez Madame. L'as-tu jamais vu mettre le pied dans une église? Non. Eh bien, méfie-toi des femmes qui n'entrent jamais dans les églises. C'est une espèce venimeuse. The audacious Neapolitan dispensed with all ceremony, and pushed his way to the presence of the princess, regardless of interposing lackey or abigail. It was in her morning room that he found the lady, seated before a miniature grand piano, surrounded by scattered music. There was an open violin case on a table, and the owner of the violin to which the case appertained was in attendance on the princess. He was a gentleman with fierce black eyes and a fierce black moustache, a moustache which for blackness and ferocity might have disputed the palm with that of the great Mocatti himself. This gentleman was no less a person than Herr Frohlich, who was greater on the violin than he was on the piano, and who condescended to improve Madame d'Asparmonte's ideas upon Beethoven and Weber by the occasional practice of concertant duets. The princess was not in her most amiable humour this morning. She had been what Mr. Mocatti called difficult, whereby sonatas and symphonies had bestrewn the ground beneath her imperial feet, thrown aside impatiently at the first syncopated passage or eccentric gradation from a minor to a major key. Herr Frohlich had endured with sublime patience, only venturing on a little serio-comic deprecation of the imperial wrath. He was one of the most constant devotees at the shrine of this uncertain divinity, and had wasted a great amount of precious time in an airy kind of worship, which might or might not find its reward in the future. People had said that the princess would end by marrying Herr Frohlich, but then, unfortunately for the Herr, this matrimonial climax had been prophesied in conjunction with so many different pretenders. Queen Elizabeth herself could scarcely have been a more difficult person to dispose of in marriage than the widow of Benjamin d'Asparmonte, banker and millionaire. So many suitors had strutted their brief hour in her salons, only to vanish into the outer darkness of that inferno where the souls of disappointed lovers are doomed to languish. Maximilian Frohlich, composer and professor of counterpoint, was one of the most patient pretenders to the royal favour. He was a gentleman who took life very pleasantly, and he endured the caprices of the princess in a philosophical spirit which was to the last degree exasperating to the lady. He was the only admirer who never flattered her, the only adorer who worshipped with head erect, and held himself sternly aloof from the humiliating service of the temple. He even treated her tant soit peu en Petruchio, laughing at her anger, defying her scorn, and looking upon his fellow pretendants with a kind of contemptuous pity. Herr Frohlich called these victims the noble army of martyrs. "I am not without my hopes," he said, when his friends questioned him about his divinity. "It is a case in which the conquering force will be the vis in tertio. The princess will tire out her admirers one after another by her caprices and exactions, her jealousies and infidelities, and the man who can stand calmly by till the last of his rivals has retired disgusted and discomfited is the man who will marry Giulia d'Asparmonte." The princess accepted this restricted homage under protest. She was always more or less angry with the professor for his attitude of self-assertion, and, accustomed as she was to walk upon the necks of her slaves, she would have given much to set her imperial foot upon this particular neck, which had never yet laid itself in the dust for her pleasure. She knew that Maximilian Frohlich was a master of his art, and while her musical monomania lasted, she had found him the most agreeable of slaves. The musical mania cooled in due course, and the princess became the devotee of art, but Herr Frohlich did not relinquish his hold upon the lady's favour. He bided his time, and when he found Madame d'Asparmonte just a little inclined to be weary of a genius that had left her walls bare and blank for the greater part of a year, the Herr returned to the charge, and offered the princess a new source of excitement in getting up of amateur concerts. The first amateur concert had proved un succès éclatant, and the professor had been restored to favor. A second concert was in preparation, a concert in which Julia d'Esparmonte was to distinguish herself in a concertante duet with the Austrian violinist, and it was the selection of the duet which employed the princess this morning. She rose suddenly from her piano with a somewhat startled air when Mr. Mocatti entered and announced. "Vous voilà de retour, Mocatti," she exclaimed, not without some slight symptoms of confusion. "What are my servants doing that they cannot announce you? C'est une entrée à la manière de Mozart. You stalk into the room like the statue in Don Giovanni. I did not even know that you were in England." "I only arrived last night, but do not let me interrupt your musical studies." "I shall play no more this morning," replied the princess impatiently. "Indeed, I doubt whether I shall play at all at my concert, Herr Frolic. You have brought me the most uninteresting compositions I ever attempted." And yet Beethoven is not often fade, but no matter, a lady's criticism must be accepted for what it is worth. Shall I see you at the opera tonight, princess? Yes, I am curious about this Swedish tenor. How does he name himself? Karlovizzi? They tell me he has created a furore at Milan and Naples. Yes, the women have talked about his pretty face and falsetto cadences. He is a man who thinks women were only born to fall in love with him. His admiration for himself is a kind of religion. And his story is romantic, is it not? Cela va sans dire. The antecedents of tenors and sopranos are always romantic. Their stories are invented for them. It is a part of the program, like that charming speech of Louis XVIII. There is nothing changed in France. There is only one Frenchman the more. Il faut que le roi ait dit quelque chose de spirituel, said the minister in his official report, and the pretty speech was composed. But the Swedish tenor? Ce n'est pas la peine d'en parler. He was a cowboy in the Dalecarlian wilds when a connoisseur overheard him singing Donizetti's music to his cows. It is the old story. There is always the ubiquitous connoisseur bent on the récolte of low-born genius. He is handsome, of course, your tenor. Apollo escaped from a bandbox. Arrivederci, Altezza. The professor replaced his violin in its case and departed after a friendly salutation to Mr. Mocatti, with whom he was acquainted. He knew his princess well enough to perceive signs of stormy weather in her darkening brows and impatient manner. "Well, Signor Mocatti," said the lady, looking up at the picture dealer with a disdainful smile as he stood before her, severe of aspect as if he had been indeed the statue in the Festin de Pierre. "In what can I have the pleasure to be agreeable to you this morning?" "Do you remember that pointed dialogue between Jehovah and the first murderer?" asked Mr. Mocatti. "But no, I do not think the Bible is one of the books your Excellency honors with your distinguished consideration. But if I were to question you, as the Creator questioned Cain, I have no doubt your reply would be an unconscious paraphrase of his." "Voilà une fort belle phrase du genre de l'ambigu comique. Will it be impertinent to ask what it means?" "It means that you have destroyed a genius who might have expanded into Raphael. I asked your sympathy, your encouragement for my protégé, Laurence Bell. I gave his future into your keeping. What have you done with it? You have exhausted his originality in the vain endeavor to satisfy the caprices which you have called suggestions. You have blighted his fancy by your impatience. You have withered his hopes by your inconstancy. You have degraded him to the lowest depths to which manhood can descend. You have made him the slave of a woman who is without heart and without honor." "Signor Mocatti." If the lightnings of Italian eyes could strike death, the Neapolitan picture dealer would have gone down before the flash that shone upon him as the princess started to her feet, splendid in her fury, and insulted Semiramis. "You dare to speak to me like this?" "Yes, princess, and again, because I know you. Je vous sais par cœur, madame. Between you and me there can be no need for ceremony. There is the memory of an old time locked in both our breasts, a time when you were something less than the widow of a millionaire, and I was something less than a wealthy picture dealer. Pardon me if the recollection is disagreeable to you. It is a hard thing, no doubt, for a princess to remember that she was once the penniless daughter of a petty Neapolitan innkeeper, affianced to the scapegrace son of a dealer in bric-a-brac, and with no brighter prospect than to succeed to the bric-a-brac shop when scapegrace's father should be so obliging as to die. Happily one day there comes into the quarter a feeble, pottering old gentleman from Rome, whose ancestral wealth is one of the favourite legends of the city, and who is money-lender in ordinary to half the royal houses of Europe. The old gentleman sees my innkeeper's handsome daughter. Nay, madame, il n'y a pas de quoi sourciller. What was Rienzi but the son of an innkeeper? Is dumbfounded by her marvellous beauty, puisqu'elle était belle alors comme les gens de choux, and marries her out of hand, whereupon the scapegrace dealer in bric-a-brac packs a few of his father's cabinet pictures in a cotton handkerchief and brings them to London, where he hires a parlour in an alley near the bank and makes for himself a business among citizens and stockbrokers. There you have a romance of real life, madame, in half a dozen sentences. I have never presumed upon these recollections. You have been pleased to patronize me en princesse, and I have been respectfully forgetful of the day in which the young marchand des objets d'art was jilted by the aubergiste's daughter. But today, when I find you in the very act of murder, the cold-blooded assassination of which a merciless coquette is capable, it is time that I should speak. It is time that I should tell you that although you may treat the rest of the world de haut en bas, you will have to hear plain truth from the lips of Antonio Mocatti. May I be permitted to ask what has inspired this long tirade? Asked the princess with a yawn which was the concentrated expression of patrician insolence. It was inspired by the sight of your victim's face. My victim? Laquelle? The last that I have seen made ready for the sacrifice. Laurence Bell. You find him looking ill? Inquired the princess with charming listlessness. I find the stamp of death upon his face, madame. He brushed his handkerchief across his lips while I was talking to him, and I saw that it was stained with blood. What of that? All artists spit blood. It is a part of their métier. Une affectation de jeune homme qui suppose un agonisant. Julia d'Asparmonte, you have neither conscience nor heart, cried the dealer savagely. Cela se peut. I suppose if I had been troubled with a conscience, it would have kept me true to the merchant of bric-a-brac, and if I had been gifted with a heart, it would have made me false to my millionaire husband. So you see, I was better off without either. Now pray, what is your ground of quarrel with me? I am a coquette? Granted. It is my pleasure to deceive men, who would find an equal pleasure in deceiving me. I use the privileges that nature and fortune have given me, and use them against the sex who know neither mercy nor honor in their dealings with mine. I am one of those women who are created every now and then to avenge the woes of their sisters. You knew me when you brought Laurence Bell to my house, and if my influence has been unfortunate for him, you should have foreseen the danger. Could I think that he would be so weak, or you so heartless? I thought that you would treat him as Julius II and Leo X treated Raphael, as Marie de Medici treated Rubens. But no, that kind of patronage would afford you no pleasure. It would not swell the muster roll of your victims, or foster your diabolical pride. All who come across your pathway must come within your thrall. Morituri te salutant. You ask neither gratitude nor friendship. You will have admiration, and always more admiration. The daughters of the horse leech are not more avid than their clamorous give, give. Shall I prophesy your future? You will outlive your beauty and your wealth. You will die without a friend, and at your last hour, when you cry aloud for a cup of cold water, it shall seem to you that the voices of your old admirers reply from a far distance, "We worshipped you in the day of your glory, and suffered the bondage of your pride. We have no part in your hour of anguish and desolation. Yes, Madame d'Esparmonte, that is the fate which overtakes heartless women." "Always supposing they are so unlike us to lose their fortunes," replied the princess with a sneer. "I trust I may be so prudent as to retain a decent income to the last, and that I may be at least provided with an experienced maid, whose petit soin may smooth the last journey, and from whose friendly hand a dose of arsenic may hasten the tardy departure. There is no such thing as purchased friendship, Madame d'Esparmonte. Let your hireling be never so faithful, you have the consciousness that her fidelity is paid for, and that, tempted by a larger wage, she will transfer her affection to your next-door neighbour. I think this must be what your evangelical preachers call an awakening sermon, Mr. Mocatti. And now that you have honoured me with all this alarming declamation, perhaps you will permit me to bid you good morning. Not till you have answered one question. I am not accustomed to be catechized, replied the princess, moving towards the door with that languid hauteur which was almost habitual to her. But since you claim the privilege of an old acquaintance, dit. Do you mean to marry Laurence Bell? Madame d'Esparmonte laughed a low melodious laugh, and looked at her questioner with supreme astonishment. Do you think I am mad? She exclaimed. I, Julie d'Esparmonte, become the wife of Mr. Bell? You know that this young man loves you, madly, passionately. I know nothing of the kind, nor am I responsible for his madness or his passion, supposing your assertion to be correct. You have fooled him to the top of his bent. In what manner have I fooled him? You recommended him to me as the fittest painter for my frescoes. I say, very well then, let him paint my frescoes. You complain to me that he has no painting room, no space in which his genius may expand its wings and soar skyward, while attached to this house there is a spacious unoccupied chamber which his pencil is to decorate. I offer him the free use of this room, and when he comes here to paint, I treat him with ordinary civility. What harm is there in all this? Only this amount of harm. Your patronage has been deadly. Your protégé is dying. There are some men who can endure to be made the plaything of a woman's cruel sport, but genius is not to be found amongst those men. Indeed, have you finished? Is there an end to your sermon? Yes, I have said more than I need have said. I shall take Laurence Bell away from this house tonight, never to re-enter it. A slow, dreamy smile crept over Madame d'Esparmonte's face. You will take him away? She said. Most certainly. Je gage que non, replied the princess with her laziest drawl. I sometimes grow tired of my admirers, but I do not allow them to grow tired of me. Vous êtes une diablesse, muttered Mr. Mocatti under his breath, and then, with a deprecating movement of his shoulders, he wished the princess good morning. She is the Millwood of the 19th century, he said to himself, and I am the uncle her victim is to murder. What a fortune I hoped to make out of that young man, and even more than fortune, what a reputation. I entrust him to this woman, believing that her influence will exalt his ambition and inspire his fancy. I come back to him to find that he has idled away a year, and that the stamp of death is on his face. But it may not yet be too late. It shall not be too late. I will not let my young genius wither and perish before my eyes. I will take him away from this hateful house. I will rescue him from the tuffet in which his genius is being devoured. Bon gré, mal gré, you have defined me, Madame d'Esparmonte. Gare à vous. End of section 10. End of volume 1 of Circe by Babington White.